Hey, welcome back, friend. Grab your blanket, get comfortable, and let the day go. Whatever happened today, the meetings, the noise, the endless notifications, none of it matters right now. Right now, it is just you, this story, and a world so different from ours that by the time we're done tonight, you might look at your own life just a little differently. And honestly, that is my favorite kind of night. So, here's something I want you to think about for a second. Imagine waking up one morning and the very first thing you see before you even leave your bed decides whether today is going to be a good day or a terrible one. Not your mood, not the weather, not your coffee, a bird, a single blackbird sitting on your window, still staring at you. And in your world, in the world you were born into, the world everyone around you believes without question that bird is not just a bird. That bird is a message. And the message is someone in your family is going to die. Now, here's the wild part. This was not a fringe belief. This was not the kind of thing whispered by a weird neighbor everyone ignored. This was how hundreds of millions of people across medieval Europe actually lived every single day for over 1,000 years. A crow on the roof, a candle that flickered the wrong way, salt that spilled across the table, a sneeze at the wrong moment. Every one of these things had a meaning. Every one of them could change what you did that day, where you went, who you talked to, whether you started a new journey or stayed safely at home. And the most remarkable thing, these people were not foolish. They were not primitive. Many of them were brilliant, creative, deeply spiritual human beings building cathedrals that still stand today, writing poetry that still moves us, asking the same questions about life and death and meaning that we still have not fully answered. They just lived in a world where the universe was alive with signals. And missing one of those signals could cost you everything. So tonight we are going back not to mock them, not to laugh at them, but to understand them, and along the way to discover that maybe, just maybe, we are not quite as different from them as we like to think. But before we go any further, if you're enjoying what we do here, if these stories are the kind of thing that makes you feel a little less alone at the end of a long day, I would love it if you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And here is what I genuinely find. Beautiful people watch these videos in the most unexpected places. Someone once told me they listen while doing dishes at midnight. Another said they put it on during a long drive through the countryside. So, wherever you are right now, your bed, your couch, your car, drop a little note in the comments. Tell me where you are, what time it is there, and what brought you here tonight. I read every single one of those comments, and they honestly make my whole week. Now, if you can dim those lights just a little, maybe turn on a gentle fan in the background, and let us begin. To understand why bad omens ruled medieval life, you first have to understand something fundamental about how medieval people saw the world. And it starts with a question that sounds almost too simple. What is the universe exactly? For you and me living in the 21st century, that question has a pretty clear framework. The universe is a physical place. It runs on laws, gravity, chemistry, biology. Things happen because of other things. A storm comes because of pressure systems. A disease spreads because of bacteria. A bird sits on your window because it is looking for food. Cause-effect, science. But for a person living in, say, 13th century France or 11th century England, the universe was something completely, fundamentally different. To them, the universe was not a machine. It was a conversation. Think about that for a moment. The greatest thinkers of the medieval world, theologians, philosophers, scholars genuinely believed that the entire natural world was a kind of divine language. God had created everything. Yes, but more than that, God was constantly speaking through everything he had created. The thunder was not just air and electricity. It was God's voice. The movement of the stars was not just orbital mechanics. It was God's hand rearranging the heavens to signal what was coming. The behavior of animals, the patterns of weather, the strange coincidences of daily life, all of it was part of an ongoing living message from the divine. Saint Bonaventure, one of the most respected theologians of the 13th century, described the entire created world as a mirror, a vast shimmering mirror through which human beings could perceive the mind of God. He wrote that whoever fails to see God in the radiance of created things is essentially blind. So in the medieval mind, the world was not silent. It was speaking constantly, and your job, your daily hourly job, was to listen. Now here is where it gets interesting and a little unsettling, because if the world is constantly sending messages, then every single thing that happens around you potentially carries meaning. And if you miss the meaning, if you ignore the sign, if you walk past the omen without noticing, well, that is on you. This was not a casual belief you could set aside when it was inconvenient. This was woven into the fabric of daily existence in ways that are almost impossible for us to fully imagine today. Historians who study this period describe a psychological state called cosmic anxiety. This ever-present low-level hum of awareness that the universe is watching you, that everything matters, that nothing is random. Imagine going through your entire life with that feeling. Not just during big moments, not just during illness or war or a solar eclipse, but every single morning when you open your eyes, every meal, every journey, every encounter with a stranger on the road. What does this mean? Is this a good sign or a bad one? Am I safe today, or is something coming? And here's the part that I think is the most human, the most tender, and honestly the most heartbreaking about all of this. These people were scared, not in a dramatic Hollywood kind of way, but in a very quiet, daily, relentless kind of way, because their world was genuinely terrifying in ways ours simply is not. The average life expectancy in medieval Europe was somewhere between 30 and 40 years. That number is a little misleading. It is dragged down by the horrifying rate of infant and child mortality. If you survive to adulthood, you might reasonably live to 60 or even 70, but the shadow of death was always close. Children died from fevers that we now treat in an afternoon. Harvests failed without warning, and entire communities faced starvation. Wars erupted over borders and dynasties and religious differences, and the soldiers who fought them often had no idea why. And plague, we will spend a lot of time on plague later in this series, because the plague changed everything. The plague could sweep through a town and kill half the people in it within a matter of weeks. And nobody, not the priests, not the doctors, not the kings, could tell you why. When your world contains that level of random, unpredictable suffering, and when you have no microscope, no germ theory, no weather satellite, no seismograph, the human mind does what it has always done. It looks for patterns. It looks for warnings because a warning, even a frightening one, is better than nothing. A warning means the universe is at least talking to you. It means the chaos is not total. It means that if you are smart enough, careful enough, attentive enough, maybe you can avoid the disaster before it arrives. That is the psychological engine behind every bad omen, every superstition, every irrational fear that ruled medieval life. It was not stupidity. It was the very human need to feel like the world makes sense. Now, you might be wondering, where exactly did these omens come from? Who decided that a crow meant death? Who decided that spilling salt was dangerous? Who decided that certain days of a year were cursed? The answer is almost nobody decided. Not in any formal, organized way. This is one of the most fascinating things about medieval superstition. Unlike the official doctrines of the church, which were written down in Latin, debated by scholars and handed down through formal institutions, the world of omens and folk beliefs lived in a completely different space. It lived in the oral tradition. It was passed from grandmother to grandchild, from innkeeper to traveler, from midwife to new mother. It accumulated over centuries, layered on top of older Roman traditions. Older still Celtic and Germanic folk beliefs. Older still the deep memory of pre-Christian cultures that stretched back beyond recorded history. Historians who have studied medieval folk superstition describe it as a kind of archaeological site where you dig down through one layer, you find another and another, each one older and stranger than the last. And this oral tradition was remarkably powerful because it was local. The omens in a village in Normandy were not quite the same as the omens in a village in Bavaria. The meaning of a particular bird sighting might be positive in one county and catastrophic in the county next door. The specific rituals you performed to ward off bad luck depended on who your great-grandmother was and what she'd learned from her great-grandmother. This patchwork of local knowledge passed down through generations was not written in any book. It cannot be looked up. It could only be remembered. And the people who remembered it were precious because they were in a very real sense the guardians of community safety. But here's a layer most people miss when they think about medieval superstitions. The church, the Catholic Church, the most powerful institution in the medieval world, had a very complicated relationship with all of this. Officially, The church condemned superstition repeatedly at councils and sermons in theological writings. One 6th-century bishop named Martin of Dumio wrote a scathing treatise called On the Correction of Peasants, in which he laments the country folk of his region for their obsession with nature spirits' lucky days and omens delivered by birds and sneezes. He was furious. He thought it was pagan nonsense. And he was also quietly fighting a losing battle. Because here's the thing. The church's own theology actually made the world of omens more believable, not less. Think about it. If you go to church every Sunday and the priest tells you that God is all-powerful, that God created every blade of grass and every sparrow in the sky, that God governs all of history and communicates through prophets and miracles, then you're already living in a world where the natural order carries divine meaning. The line between a miracle and a bad omen is thinner than you think. And over the centuries, what happened in many places was not that the church erased folk superstition. It absorbed it. It blessed it. It gave it new Christian clothing. The ancient fear of certain unlucky days became the church's calendar of feast days and fast days and days when certain activities were forbidden. The old folk practice of carrying protective charms became the wearing of saints' medals and holy relics. The ancient belief that certain people could read signs in nature was transformed into the concept of holy men and women with prophetic gifts. The boundary between official religion and unofficial superstition in the medieval world was in practice far more porous than anyone in authority would have liked to admit. And so the ordinary medieval person, the farmer, the blacksmith, the midwife, the merchant, navigated this world with a layered set of beliefs that pulled in multiple directions at once. They went to Mass on Sunday and prayed to God. And on Monday morning, they looked at which bird landed on their fence post before they decided whether to begin their journey. And on Tuesday, when they accidentally knocked over the salt at dinner, they threw a pinch of it over their left shoulder, not because a priest told them to, but because their mother told them to, and her mother before her. And the fear in their gut was very, very real. They were not hypocrites. They were not confused. They were human beings doing exactly what human beings do when they are afraid of a world they cannot control. They used every tool available to them. Here's a detail I find quietly amazing. Historians who have studied medieval almanacs, those little calendar books that literate people used to plan their year, have found that many of them contained lists of what were called damali, evil days. Not just unlucky days, evil days. Days when you should not travel. Days when you should not begin any new business. Days when you should not get married, make any major decision, or even in some cases eat certain foods. These lists varied from almanac to almanac and from region to region, but they were taken with profound seriousness. One set of almanacs from 15th century England identifies 3 Mondays in the year as particularly dangerous. The first Monday of April, the second Monday of August, and the last Monday of December. Travel on those days. You might never return. And while the church periodically tried to replace these evil days with saints' feast days, tried to give the calendar a proper Christian meaning, the folk beliefs persisted well into the 19th century in some parts of Europe because the fear was older than Christianity. And fear, as we all know, is very, very hard to teach away. So this is the world we're entering tonight. A world where the universe is alive. Where every crow, every candle flame, every dropped piece of salt is a sentence in a language that God or fate or nature or something older and darker than either is constantly writing. A world where being a good observer could save your life, and missing a single sign might end it. A world where the line between the physical and the spiritual was not just thin, it barely existed at all. And in the coming parts of this story, we're going to walk through that world together, one omen at a time. We will stand under the stars and watch a comet tear across the sky, and feel the cold dread that every person in the village below felt when they saw it, because they knew that something terrible was coming. We will meet the black cats who were hunted into near extinction and discover that in one of history's darkest ironies, that very extinction made the thing people feared most far, far worse. We will sit at a medieval dinner table and watch a man spill the salt and see the faces of everyone around him change. And we will follow the thread all the way to the most violent and heartbreaking places that fear of bad omens ever led the witch trials, the pogroms, the executions of innocent people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when a sign appeared in the sky. But before we get to any of that, we need to understand the single most powerful force that turned ordinary medieval life into a world ruled by signs, the sky, and what medieval people saw written in it. Because you think you've ever been afraid of something, wait until you hear what happened the last time a comet appeared over England. The year was 1066, and it changed everything. Picture this for a moment. You're a monk in the year 729 somewhere in the green, mist-covered hills of Northumbria, northern England. Your name does not matter. What matters is this. You're sitting in your script room before dawn, candle flickering, and the sky outside your narrow window is doing something strange. Two comets, not one, two, moving together through the darkness above you, trailing fire like twin wounds across the face of heaven. You have studied your scripture. You have read the great venerable Bede who wrote just a few years earlier that comets are, and I want you to hear his exact words because they are beautiful and terrifying in equal measure stars with flames like hair born suddenly, portending a change of royal power or plague, or wars or winds or heat. You set down your quill. You stop writing whatever you were writing, and you wait because you know the way you know the sun will rise that what just appeared in your sky was not an accident. It was a sentence from God written in fire across the only page large enough to hold it. The question is simply what it says. Here is what I find endlessly fascinating about that moment, and about the entire web of belief we're going to explore in this part of our story tonight. The monk in that script room was not being naive. He was not being primitive. He was doing exactly what the most educated, most careful, most intellectually rigorous thinkers of his time told him was correct. Because in the medieval world, the idea that God communicated through nature was not folklore. It was official theology. And that is the thing that most modern people completely miss when they try to understand medieval superstition. We tend to imagine a neat division. The church over here doing real religion, and then the peasants over there with their folk beliefs and their bad omens and their silly fears. But the reality was far messier, far more interesting, and honestly far more human than that. The church did not just tolerate the idea that the natural world carried divine messages. In many ways, it built it. Let us start at the very top. The Bible itself, the foundational text of medieval European life, is absolutely saturated with the idea that God speaks through natural events. In the book of Exodus, God announces his presence at Mount Sinai through thunder and lightning so violent that the entire mountain shakes, and the people watching from the plain below fall on their faces in terror. In the book of Revelation, pestilence, famine, war, and death are explicitly described as signs heralding the final judgment. The prophet Ezekiel records visions of strange lights in the sky that sound remarkably like what a medieval chronicler might describe as a comet. So when a medieval peasant looked at a blood-red moon rising over the eastern hills and felt cold dread spreading through their chest, they were not doing something separate from their religion. They were living their religion. They were reading the world the way they had been told by the most authoritative voices. They knew that the world was meant to be read, and the scholars made this framework extraordinarily specific. Isidore of Seville, a 7th century bishop and scholar who essentially compiled everything the medieval world knew about the natural sciences into one monumental work called the Ethnology, wrote with great confidence that comets signaled the coming of pestilence and war. Not might signal, not sometimes coincided with signaled full-stop bead built on Isidore's work, and elaborated, it connecting specific astronomical events to specific historical disasters with the confidence of a man doing mathematics, not guesswork. And here's the thing about Bede. He was not a credulous country priest. He was one of the most brilliant and careful scholars in all of early medieval Europe. His ecclesiastical history of the English people is still read by historians today as a primary source of remarkable precision and intellectual integrity. When Bede told you that two comets in the sky meant something terrible was coming, you did not argue with Bede. So by the time an ordinary person in, say, 12th century France looked up and saw something strange in the sky, they were not just drawing on grandmother's folk wisdom. They were drawing on a tradition stretching from the Bible, through Isidore, through Bede, through the local priests who had studied those texts and passed their meaning down in sermons year after year, generation after generation. The omen was not a superstition layered on top of religion. The omen was the religion lived and breathed and felt in the pit of the stomach. Now, here's where I want to pause and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you could not explain why something bad happened, and your mind immediately started looking for what you did wrong, what you missed, what sign you should have seen? I think most of us have a relationship ends unexpectedly. A job falls through a health scare, arrives out of nowhere, and the human mind almost involuntarily starts asking, was there a warning? Did I miss it? That impulse, that desperate backward search for the signal we should have read, is, I would argue, not so different from what the medieval mind was doing every single day. Except in the medieval world, that impulse was not a private anxiety you kept to yourself. It was codified, systematized, officially blessed by the most powerful institution on the continent. The church did not create the fear of bad omens, but it absolutely gave that fear its architecture. Let me give you a specific example that I think illustrates this better than any theoretical argument could. The year is 1066. You probably know what happened in 1066. The Norman conquest of England, William defeating Harold at the Battle of Hastings, one of the most consequential military events in all of English history. But before that battle, something appeared in the sky. Hall's Comet. Though nobody called it that, of course, since it would not be named after the astronomer Edmund Halley for another 600 years. To the people who saw it in the spring of 1066, it was simply a terrifying light in the sky, visible even during the day, for a period blazing with such brightness the chronicles describe people standing in the streets and staring upward with their mouths open. And we know this because it was recorded in exquisite detail, not just in written chronicles, but sewn into fabric. The Bew Tapestry, that remarkable 70 long embroidered narrative of the Norman conquest, depicts the comet explicitly. You can see it today if you visit Bayeux in northern France. A blazing star stitched in colored thread hovering above a group of terrified Englishmen who point upward with the expressions of people who have just read their own death sentence. Underneath the comet in the tapestry, there's a scene of men whispering to King Harold. They are telling him, bringing him the news of the omen, and below that scene, stitched into the same strip of linen, ghostly ships appear at the bottom of the frame, William's invasion fleet. The tapestry does not present this as a coincidence. The visual logic is unmistakable and intentional. The comet came, the invasion followed. The comet told you it was coming. For medieval audiences looking at that tapestry, there was no gap between the sign and the event. They were one continuous story written first in the sky and then played out on Earth. But here's something I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it reveals something profound about how this whole system worked. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the great running record of English history kept by monks across several monasteries, describes William's victory at Hastings with a phrase that I find genuinely moving in its anguish. The English submitted, it says, seeing that God willed not better things for our sins. Not the English were defeated because William had better cavalry tactics, or because Harold made a strategic mistake, or because the English army was exhausted from marching 400 in 2 weeks because of our sins. Do you see what is happening there? The omen in the sky was not just a prediction. It was a verdict. The comet appeared not to warn England, but to announce that England had already been judged, that the disaster was already decided, and that the English people needed to search their own hearts and ask themselves what they had done to deserve it. This is a theological worldview of extraordinary psychological power and extraordinary psychological weight, because it means that when disaster struck, when the harvest failed, when the plague arrived, when the army lost the battle, the question was never just what happened. The question was always, what did we do to bring this upon ourselves? Every bad omen carried within it a silent accusation, and the church was remarkably specific about what those accusations might concern. Here is a detail that I genuinely love, not because it is comforting, but because it is so wonderfully vividly human. Medieval sermons, the primary vehicle through which ordinary people received theological instruction, since most people could not read, were full of what scholars today call exemplar. Little cautionary stories, usually quite dramatic, designed to illustrate the danger of particular sins. One entire category of these exemplar concerned the reading of omens themselves. A woman hears a rooster crow 5 times. A famous example goes, she decides this means she has 5 years left to live. When she later falls ill, she tells herself, not yet. I still have time. She refuses the last rites. She dies without confession, and she goes directly to hell. The moral is not that omens are wrong. The moral is that you should trust God more than you trust the omens, which is a very different message if you think about it, because embedded in that sermon is the acknowledgement that people were absolutely reading omens, absolutely making life decisions based on what they heard in the Ruer's Crow or saw on the Comet's Trail, and that the church's job was not to say there are no signs, but to say be careful which signs you trust, and never trust them more than you trust the church's authority. That is a needle threading of remarkable subtlety, and it tells you everything about the position the church occupied simultaneously, the voice warning people away from superstition and the institution whose entire theological framework made the superstition seem rational in the first place. Let us talk about thunder for a moment, because I think it is the clearest example of how the boundary between official theology and everyday superstition dissolved completely in practice. When lightning struck a building in medieval Europe, and this was not uncommon in a world full of tall stone towers and very few lightning rods, the first question was not how tall was the building, and did it have a metal spire that attracted the strike. The first question was who had sinned. We have a remarkable document from medieval Florence, a detailed chronicle kept by a citizen named Luca Landucci that records lightning strikes in the city over several decades in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. When lightning struck the great cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore on the 5th of April, 1492, and knocked marble niches crashing to the floor. Landucci recorded it with the solemnity of a man writing down a prophecy. And indeed, what happened shortly afterward, Lorenzo the Magnificent, the most powerful man in Florence, fell gravely ill and died within days. To Landucci and everyone around him, the connection was self-evident. The lightning had spoken. It had not been a matter of atmospheric electricity seeking the path of least resistance to the ground. It had been a message delivered to a specific city at a specific moment about a specific man whose time was coming. This is how the medieval mind worked. Not because medieval people were credulous fools, but because they had been given a comprehensive, internally consistent, theologically authorized framework within which this interpretation was not just reasonable, but required. To look at that lightning strike and say just a coincidence would have been in their context, not enlightened skepticism. It would have been a kind of moral blindness, a failure to read the text that God had put in front of you. And what I find most poignant about all of this, what keeps pulling me back to this period of history every time I think I understand it, is the loneliness of the people who could not read the signs. Because in a world where the universe is constantly speaking, the worst possible fate is not that the universe sends you bad news. The worst fate is that the universe sends you a message and you are too distracted, too sinful, too spiritually dull to understand it. And then the disaster arrives and everyone around you could trace it back. There was the comet, there was the blood-red moon, there was the rooster crowing at midnight, and you missed every one of them. That was not just bad luck in the medieval worldview. That was a kind of spiritual failure. The anxiety this produced was real, chronic, and woven into the fabric of every ordinary day. Because if God was speaking through everything, through the weather, through the animals, through the behavior of candle flames, and the timing of sneezes and the pattern of stars, then you could never truly relax your attention. The message might come at any moment, in any form, and the cost of missing it might be your life. This, I think, is the psychological core of everything we're going to explore together as this story continues. The bad omens were not the disease. They were the symptoms. The disease was the terror of living in a universe that watched you, judged you, and communicated its judgments through a language you could never be entirely sure you were reading correctly. And once you understand that, once you feel the weight of that particular kind of fear in your own chest, even just for a moment, then everything else we're going to see in this story starts to make perfect sense. The animals people feared, the objects they were afraid to touch, the days they refused to leave their houses, all of it flows from this one source. The belief that the world around you is not neutral, not random, not silent. It was speaking, and it was speaking about you. So this is the sky you're now standing under. This is the world you now inhabit, at least for the length of this story. And now I want to take you somewhere specific, somewhere that I promise you will not expect. Because we have been talking about comets and eclipses, The big dramatic signs that everybody noticed that made it into the chronicles and the tapestries and the sermons. But the vast majority of bad omens in medieval life had nothing to do with the night sky. They lived much closer to home. They lived in the fields, on the roads, on the rooftops. They had feathers and beaks and eyes that seemed to people watching them to hold a knowledge that no animal should possess. The story of what medieval people believed about animals and fate is one of the strangest, most detailed, and in one case most darkly ironic chapters in all of human history. Because there is one creature in particular whose story I have to tell you. An animal that was feared so deeply, so systematically across so much of medieval Europe, that the fear itself became one of the contributing causes of the very disaster people feared most. And by the time we're done with that story, I think you will never look at a black cat quite the same way again, right? Let's talk about animals. Specifically, let us talk about the animals that medieval people genuinely believed could determine whether you lived or died not through any action of their own, but simply by showing up, by existing near you, by crossing your path at the wrong moment. Because in the medieval world, the animal kingdom was not just a collection of creatures going about their biological business. It was an elaborate living code, a system of signs written in feathers and fur and cold watching eyes. And learning to read that code was in many communities as essential a survival skill as knowing how to store grain or patch a roof before winter. The question I want to start with is one that I think deserves a moment of honest reflection. Have you ever noticed how certain animals make you feel uncomfortable? Not because they have done anything to you, not because they pose any real threat, but just because something about their presence activates a very old, very quiet part of your brain that says wrong. Something about this is wrong. A raven landing too close and staring at you with those unervingly intelligent eyes. A black cat slipping silently across an empty road at night. An owl calling from a dead tree at noon when owls are supposed to be sleeping. That discomfort you feel, that is not weakness. That is not irrationality. That is, I would argue, a very ancient inheritance, an echo of something your ancestors felt so deeply and so collectively that it worked its way into the human nervous system and stayed there. And nowhere in human history did that ancient animal fear run deeper or carry more specific meaning than in medieval Europe. Start with the raven because the raven's story in the medieval imagination is unlike almost any other creature's. Ravens have been part of the human story for an extraordinarily long time. They appear in the book of Genesis, the very first bird mentioned by name in the Hebrew scriptures, sent out from Noah's Ark to search for dry land. In Norse mythology, Odin the All-Father kept two ravens named Hugin and Munin Thought and Memory, who flew across the 9 worlds every day and returned to whisper in his ears the secrets of gods and men. In Celtic tradition, the raven was bound to the Morgan, the goddess of battle and fate, who sometimes took the form of the bird herself, circling above the battlefield to choose who would fall. This is an animal carrying centuries of accumulated symbolic weight before any medieval person ever looked up and saw one. And what they saw when they looked was something genuinely eerie. Ravens are enormous. People who have never encountered one up close are always surprised by the size. A large raven can be 55 to 65 centimeters long with a wingspan stretching past 1.5 meters. Their feathers are not simply black. In direct sunlight, they catch a deep, iridescent blue-green sheen, like oil on dark water. Their calls are extraordinary, a deep, resonant crunk that carries an uncanny quality, almost mechanical, almost deliberate. And their eyes watch you with an intelligence that is hard to dismiss as mere animal instinct. Because ravens actually are extraordinarily intelligent. Modern cognitive science has established that ravens can solve multi-step problems, recognize individual human faces, remember specific people across years, and plan for future events. A cognitive ability long thought to be uniquely human. Medieval people had no access to cognitive science, of course, but they noticed the eyes. They noticed the way the birdwatch seemed to consider, seemed to know. A 15th century source recorded in the folklore collections of later scholars carries this observation framed as plain matter of fact. If a superstitious man hears a raven croak from the roof of a nearby house, he makes his will. Not might make it, makes it, because the raven has spoken, and what the raven says is not difficult to interpret. Now, here's the specific quality of the raven as an omen that I find most historically interesting because it tells us something true about how medieval minds worked. The raven did not mean one fixed thing. Its meaning shifted depending on several variables: where it appeared, how it behaved, which direction it flew, whether it called once or multiple times, whether it appeared before sunrise or after sunset. A raven calling from a rooftop was one message. A raven flying west in the morning was another. A raven circling a house 3 times was something else entirely. And a group of ravens gathering in numbers, settling in trees near a road, or a building that was perhaps the worst sign of all. This interpretive complexity is not a sign that medieval people were confused about what ravens meant. It is a sign that they had developed an extraordinarily detailed system for reading the world around them. A system with nuance and local variation and enough internal logic to feel genuinely useful. Because, of course, confirmation bias is a powerful thing. And when you expect the raven to predict disaster often enough, you will find plenty of examples that seem to confirm the pattern. By the time Shakespeare was writing, which is admittedly after the medieval period ends, but deeply rooted in its folk tradition, the raven appears in play after play as a creature whose very voice signals catastrophe. In Athol, Shakespeare writes of the raven hovering over the infected house. The medieval audience who saw and heard those words did not need the character to explain what it meant. They already knew. But the raven, for all its fearsome reputation, could at least be kept at a respectful distance. You could avoid the rooftop where the raven sat. You could change your route home. You could lower your eyes and walk quickly and get indoors before called a second time. The animal at the center of the most complicated, most consequential, and honestly most heartbreaking omen story in all of medieval Europe was one that could not be avoided so easily because it lived in your house. Or it used it anyway until medieval Europe did something so catastrophically misguided, so breathtakingly self-defeating that historians still shake their heads at the irony of it nearly 8 centuries later. I am talking about the cat, and specifically I'm talking about what happened on the 13th of June, 1233, when a document was written in Rome that would reshape the fate of Europe in ways that nobody who wrote it could possibly have imagined. Here is the historical situation as clearly and accurately as I can lay it out for you, because this story's been told wrong so many times that it is worth getting it right. Pope Gregory I, who became Pope in 1227 at the remarkable age of approximately 80 years old, was a man dealing with a genuinely alarming problem. An inquisitor named Conrad of Marburg had been investigating a heretical sect in the Rhineland region of Germany and was reporting back to Rome with descriptions of their rituals that were, to put it gently, designed to shock. Conrad described devil worship. He described a cult whose initiates kissed a large toad on the mouth. He described a black cat-like figure, a demonic entity in the shape of a cat that participants in these rituals revered and paid homage to. Gregory believed him, and on the 13th of June, 1233, he issued a papal letter called the Vox in Rama. The voice from Rama addressed to the King of Germany and the Archbishop of Mainz. The letter is historically important, but it is also widely misunderstood. Contrary to the popular version of this story, Gregory's letter was not an order to kill cats across Europe. It was a condemnation of a specific heretical cult in a specific region of Germany. The demonic figure it describes is not a real cat, but a ritual effigy. But here's the thing about documents like this. In a world where information traveled by word of mouth, where most people could not read, and where a papal letter was not a legal statute with careful definitions, but a piece of sacred authority that filtered down through layers of interpretation and sermon and frightened local gossip. What people heard was simpler than what Gregory wrote. They heard the Pope says, cats, especially black cats, are connected to the devil. And once that interpretation entered the air, it spread with a momentum that nobody in Rome could have predicted or controlled. What followed across much of Europe over the next several centuries is genuinely difficult to read about if you are a person who has ever loved an animal. Black cats, already associated in popular folk belief with darkness night and the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it, became targets of a systematic fear that expressed itself in ritualized violence. In France, the practice of cat burning became embedded in the festival calendar. On the 24th of June each year, The Feast of St. John the Baptist communities gathered in public squares where cats, often black cats, gathered in large numbers, were suspended in sacks above bonfires and burned alive. The screaming of the animals heard through the sacks was interpreted not as the suffering of creatures, but as the shrieking of demons being defeated. Some chroniclers record people watching this with expressions of relief, even celebration. They genuinely believed they were protecting their community from supernatural harm. In the Belgian city of EIP, cats were thrown from the belfry of the local church tower during an annual festival. The practice was common enough that the city still holds a symbolic cat-throwing festival today, though with stuffed animals, not living ones, called the cat and STO. Elderly women who kept cats as companions were particularly vulnerable to the accusation that this very attachment proved something sinister. The historian Virginia Holmgren described with painful precision how an old woman living alone with a cat as her only real company could be destroyed by a single suspicious neighbor. A cat pouncing playfully on a broomstick outside the door, lifting it briefly into the air, seen through the wrong eyes in the wrong moment by someone already predisposed to look for evidence. And suddenly the story of a witch riding her broomstick was already forming in the telling. The result across decades, and then centuries, was a significant reduction in the cat population across large parts of Europe. And here is where the story becomes something that a screenwriter pitching it today would probably be told sounds too convenient to be real. Because while the cats were being feared and killed as agents of darkness, while communities were quite literally driving away the one creature most naturally suited to controlling the rodent population of their towns and fields and granaries, something was happening in the ports of Asia and the cargo ships of the Mediterranean trade routes. A bacterium was moving. The bacterium we now call Yinia pestis, though no one knew its name or its nature for another 600 years, carried by fleas which lived on rats which followed human civilization wherever it went. By 1347, those ships had arrived in Sicily. I want to be careful here because this particular story has been oversimplified into an internet meme that serious historians rightly push back against. The connection between cat persecution and plague severity is not as straightforward or as documented as the popular version suggests. Cats are not immune to plague themselves. They can actually carry the disease. Rats were not the only plague vector, and cat populations, even when reduced, were not eliminated because cats are too resourceful and too difficult to catch to be completely eradicated across an entire continent. But the broader truth that this story points toward is real and documented. The world of medieval Europe was a world where animals that posed no actual supernatural threat were treated as enemies, where a creature that might have helped to some degree control the rodent populations of grain stores and city streets was instead driven away or destroyed. And when the plague arrived, it moved through populations that had already been weakened by crop failures, malnutrition, and a breakdown in the ordinary biological checks and balances that a healthy ecosystem provides. The bad omen in the most literal and tragic sense became self-fulfilling. Not because the cat was ever a supernatural agent of evil, but because the fear of evil had made human beings destroy one of their own most useful allies. Let me pause here for a moment and ask you something, because I think this particular story deserves a genuine question. Is it possible, and I mean this sincerely, not rhetorically, is it possible that we still do things like this? We still allow fear of something misunderstood to drive us toward actions that make our actual situation worse. I think about that medieval person watching the cat burning festival, genuinely believing they were making their community safer. And I wonder how many things we do today from a similar mixture of fear and incomplete information and the powerful human desire to act to do something when the world feels threatening and we cannot see the actual enemy. The medieval people were not foolish, but fear married to certainty without the corrective of careful skepticism. That combination has produced tragedies in every century. There's included. The cat and the raven are only two threads in what turns out to be an enormous, intricate tapestry of animal omens that medieval people read every single day. There were owls whose calls at midday or near human habitation were understood as certain announcements of a coming death. There were dogs that howled for reasons their owners could not identify. Behavior read not as the dog responding to sounds humans could not hear, but as the dog perceiving something at the boundary between the visible world and whatever lay beyond it. There was the run, which was paradoxically considered sacred, but also feared in specific circumstances, killed ceremonially on the 26th of December, the feast of Saint Stephen, in a ritual that combined old Celtic belief with its new Christian clothing. There was the hare whose crossing of a path was bad luck of the most direct kind, and whose appearance near a pregnant woman was considered so dangerous that women in some regions would change their entire route home rather than walk anywhere a hare had recently run. What all of these animal omens shared was a quality that I think says something deeply true about the medieval imagination and about human imagination in general. They all involve creatures that occupied the boundary between the known and the unknown. Animals of the night, animals of unusual intelligence, animals whose behaviors seemed to exceed what simple instinct could explain. The medieval world had no clear line between the natural and the supernatural. The two were woven together seamlessly, with the animal kingdom serving as the most accessible interface between them. The living creatures that crossed back and forth between the world of human daylight and whatever lay in the dark beyond the firelight. Which means that every raven, every cat, every midnight howling dog was in the medieval mind a message from the other side. And the other side, it was generally agreed, had a great deal to say. What we have explored here is only the surface of the animal world's role in medieval omen reading, and all of it, the ravens, the cats, the owls, the hares, was ultimately part of the larger system we began exploring in the last section. A system where nature spoke, where God wrote messages in the behavior of creatures, where the universe maintained a constant, watchful commentary on human affairs. But there's a place in this story where things get even more intimate, even more immediate. Because as unsettling as it was to encounter a raven on your rooftop or a cat crossing your path at midnight, those were at least things outside your house. What about the objects inside it? What about the bread you baked? The salt you kept, the mirror on your wall? What about the entirely ordinary actions of an entirely ordinary day? The things you touched, picked up, put down that could, in the wrong moment, in the wrong way, announce with quiet finality that something terrible was already on its way. Because the most pervasive bad omens in medieval life were not dramatic. They were not ravens in the sky or comets blazing overhead. They were sitting on your kitchen table. And the story of what medieval people believed about ordinary objects, about the things you held in your hands every single day, is stranger and more revealing and somehow more deeply human than anything we have discussed so far. We ended the last part of our story with a question. The most pervasive bad omens in medieval life were not the ravens in the sky or the comets blazing overhead. They were not the cursed calendar dates or the animals that crossed your path. They were sitting on your kitchen table. And I want to start tonight's part of our journey with something that I think will land differently once you understand the full weight of what I am about to tell you. Imagine you're in a medieval European kitchen. It is an ordinary morning gray light through a small window. A fire just coming back to life from last night's embers. The smell of wood smoke and bread. You're reaching for the salt cellar in the center of the table, and you knock it over. The salt cascades across the rough wooden surface in silence. And in that silence, your stomach drops. Not because you have wasted something expensive, though. Salt in the medieval world was genuinely precious, sometimes used as currency worth more per ounce than many spices. Not because your breakfast is ruined, because of what it means, because you have just done what Judas did. Now, I want to unpack that slowly because the salt superstition is perhaps the most layered, historically rich, and psychologically revealing bad omen in the entire medieval domestic world. It brings together threads from ancient Rome, ancient Sumeria, Christian theology, and the biology of agricultural land, all compressed into one small ceramic pot, sitting in the center of every medieval kitchen table in Europe. Let us start at the very beginning. Around 3,500 years before the Common Era, the ancient Sumerians were the first civilization we have documented records of treating salt as a spiritually significant substance. When they spilled it, they threw a pinch over their left shoulder to counteract the bad luck. We know this from clay tablets, some of the earliest written records of human superstition we possess. Think about that for a moment. The gesture you perform today, if you spill salt, if you still perform it, and many people instinctively do that. Gesture was already old when the pyramids were being built. But the Sumerians' version was about economics and scarcity. Salt was precious. You wasted it. You suffered. The universe noted your carelessness. The Romans added an extra layer. They associated salt specifically with friendship and loyalty. The Latin word salarium, meaning salt allowance, is where our word salary comes from. Roman soldiers received an allowance to purchase salt as part of their wages. Salt was currency, yes, but more than that, it was a bond. To offer someone salt at your table was to seal a relationship of mutual trust. To spill it, to shatter that bond carelessly, was to invite betrayal. And then Christianity arrived, and Leonardo da Vinci painted his Last Supper. You know, the painting, almost certainly along table 13, figures the moment before everything falls apart. And in the painting, if you look carefully at the figure of Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, his forearm has accidentally knocked the salt cellar on its side. Salt spilled. Betrayal announced. Catastrophe incoming. Whether Leonardo intended this as a conscious sign or simply used existing iconographic tradition, historians debate the exact intent. The result was that every medieval person who saw this image or heard it described in a sermon now carried inside them a specific visual memory. The spilling of salt is what Judas did. In the church, which used salt to make holy water, which incorporated salt into its most sacred rituals of purification and protection, gave it a religious significance that made every overturned salt cellar in every kitchen in Europe a potential act of desecration. So you throw a pinch over your left shoulder. Why the left? Because in the medieval theological framework, the left side was the devil's side, the side of shadows, of sinister intention. And that word sinister means simply left in Latin. Remember, the devil was believed to stand perpetually at your left shoulder, waiting for an opening. The pinch of salt thrown over that shoulder was aimed directly at his eyes, blinding him, buying you a moment of protected time before he could exploit your moment of carelessness. Can you think of a more compact, more efficient defensive gesture? 500 years of religious symbolism and folk belief compressed into one flick of the wrist. But salt was only one of the objects in that medieval kitchen that could speak to you. Let me tell you about the bread. Bread in the medieval world was not merely food. It was life itself. The breaking of bread at Mass was the highest sacrament. The Lord's Prayer asked specifically for it. Give us this day our daily bread. And in a world where harvest failures could kill entire communities, that petition was not metaphorical. It was urgent, which meant that bread carried a weight of meaning that made its every behavior potentially significant. A large air hole discovered inside a freshly cut loaf, a hollow in the crumb, was understood in many parts of medieval Europe as the sign of a coming death. The space inside the bread was the shape of a grave. A loaf that failed to rise properly in the oven was not merely a baking failure. The devil, according to folk belief from Germany to France, liked to sit on bread dough and prevent it from rising. This is why many medieval bakers and many ordinary households doing their own baking scored a cross into the top of the raw loaf before it went into the oven. Not for decoration, to drive the devil off the surface of the dough so the bread could rise undisturbed. And then there's the most specific, most historically grounded bread omen of all, the upside-down loaf. In medieval France, and spreading across much of Europe with the French baking tradition, bakers followed a practice that was at once entirely practical and deeply unsettling. On the mornings when a public execution was scheduled in the town, and public executions in the medieval world were frequent, often coinciding with market days, so the maximum number of people could witness them as a deterrent. The town baker faced a specific problem. The executioner had no time to come to the bakery in the morning. He was busy. He had preparations to make tools, to sharpen, an event to manage. So the baker would set aside one loaf for him, and to identify that loaf, to mark it as reserved, as belonging to the man of death, as something no ordinary customer should touch, the baker would place it upside down on the shelf. The customers who came in that morning knew what it meant. They saw the inverted loaf, and they did not touch it. They bought their bread, and they left perhaps a little faster than usual, and later when the executioner came in, he could take his loaf without ceremony. Now, what happened to the mind of medieval Europe over the generations of this practice? The upside-down loaf became associated with death, with the executioner, with the specific evil of a man whose daily work was to end other men's lives. To accidentally place your own bread upside down on your table was to invite that energy, that death adjacency, into your home. If you did it accidentally, there was a remedy. You could draw a cross on the flat underside of the loaf with a knife before eating it to cancel the omen, But you had to know to do it, and you had to do it immediately. Here is the detail I find most remarkable about this bread superstition. It is still practiced in parts of France today, in restaurants and French homes. There are people, not many, but they exist, who will instinctively write an upside-down baguette without quite being able to tell you why. The executioner whose loaf, it was his 700 years in his grave. The public executions in the market square are 700 years in the past. But the gesture remembers what the mind has forgotten. Let me pause here for a moment, because I want to ask you something. Do you still have certain rules about food that you follow without quite knowing where they came from? Rules passed down by a grandparent, perhaps. Don't put your knife pointed towards someone. Don't place bread on top of other food. Never let the salt touch certain things. I ask because the domestic food omens of the medieval world are, I think, the most intimate proof that the omen system did not just live in the church and the castle and the scholar's scriptorum. It lived in the kitchen. It lived in the daily, unconscious, unremarkable acts of preparing and eating food. And it is still there. But let us move from the kitchen table to the bedroom wall. Because the next ordinary object that could in the medieval world announce catastrophe was not made of bread or salt, but of silver. Mirrors. A medieval mirror was not the common household item we take completely for granted today. Before the 16th century, when Venetian glassmakers developed a cheaper production method, a good silver-backed mirror was an object of significant luxury. Only the wealthy owned them. They were valuable, fragile, and in the medieval imagination, deeply strange. Because what does a mirror do? It shows you yourself. It holds your face in its surface, your expression, your eyes looking back at you. And in a world where the body was understood as a vessel for the soul, where the soul was real, present, locatable, the image in a mirror was not mere reflection. It was a representation of the soul itself. The mirror held something essential about you, which meant that when it broke, the thing it held broke with it. The specific superstition about broken mirrors giving 7 years of bad luck is actually more ancient and more philosophically developed than most people realize. In the 1st century of the Common Era, Roman scholars documented a belief about health cycles. The human body, they reasoned, underwent a complete physical renewal every 7 years. The body you had at 21 was genuinely different from the body you had at 14. Different cells, different proportions, different capacities. A mirror's broken image in this framework represented a break in the continuity of the self. The distorted or shattered reflection meant 7 years of health misfortune, the span of one complete bodily cycle before the self could be whole again. Medieval Europe inherited this belief and deepened it with Christian theology. The soul as the mirror of God, the face as the outward expression of the inner spiritual condition. To shatter the mirror was to shatter the visible evidence of the soul's integrity. And then there was the practical dimension that made the belief burn particularly bright in medieval households. A Venetian silver-backed mirror cost in the 15th century roughly the equivalent of several months of a servant's wages. A single mirror might represent a significant portion of a household's wealth. When a servant broke one, the financial consequences were severe enough that the 7-year timeline made a grim kind of practical sense. It would take approximately 7 years of service to work off the debt. The historian Milton Goldsmith, writing in the early 20th century, documented a medieval practice called catoptromancy divination using a mirror and water. The mirror was lowered into a bowl of water, and a sick person was asked to look at their reflection in the disturbed surface. If the image appeared clear, they would recover. If it appeared distorted, they would not. The medieval mirror, in other words, was not a vanity tool. It was a diagnostic instrument, a window not into the room behind you, but into the state of your soul. And breaking it did not just carry 7 years of bad luck. It announced that the window had been closed, that the soul's visibility, its legibility, had been shattered. The remedies were elaborate and specific. You could bury the pieces by moonlight. You could pound them into dust. You could place them in running water. Some sources recommended waiting 7 hours before even touching the broken pieces, because the misfortune had to settle before it could be contained. None of these remedies spared a servant from their employer's anger, of course. But that is a problem that no amount of folk theology could fully address. Now, here's something I want you to notice about all 3 of the objects we've examined in this part of our story. The salt cellar, the bread loaf, the mirror. Each one of them is extraordinary precisely because it is so ordinary. We're not talking about comets or ravens, dramatic, unusual, clearly significant things that interrupt daily life and demand attention. We're talking about the objects that were present at every meal, in every household, every single day. And that is the most psychologically significant aspect of the medieval domestic omen system. It was not a special awareness you could turn on for dramatic occasions and turn off for ordinary ones. It was an awareness that the universe required of you at every moment, in every context, with every object you touched. The salt on your table was not just salt. The bread on your shelf was not just bread. The mirror on your wall was not just a mirror. Everything was a potential text. Everything could speak. Everything could announce in a moment of carelessness or bad fortune that something was coming. And in the spirit of that total pervasive awareness, let me tell you about one more object from the medieval domestic world. An object so ordinary you probably have one near you right now. A candle. Medieval people spent their lives inside the radius of candle flames. After sunset, the candle was civilization. It was warmth. It was safety. It was the single point of human order against the absolute darkness of the medieval night, and it spoke constantly. A candle that guttered sideways in still air, that bent its flame without any breeze to move. It was one of the most reliably noticed domestic omens in the medieval world. Still air means nothing should move the flame, and yet it moves. Something that cannot be seen is moving it. A candle that went out without apparent cause was worse. Darkness arriving ahead of schedule. The protective light extinguished without warning. So, medieval household guides distinguish between different kinds of candle behavior with extraordinary specificity. A flame that burned with unusual brightness indicated a visitor coming. A flame that split into two forks was a sign of division in the household, in the family, in the community. A candle that dripped wax in unusual shapes could be read like tea leaves. The patterns in the cooled wax carrying their own interpretable language. Candlemas candles blessed in church on the 2nd of February carried extra protective power precisely because of this volatility. If the ordinary candle was already a text, the blessed candle was a text in a protected language. Let me give you a final image for this part of our story, and then I want to move us somewhere new. Somewhere that takes everything we have discussed about exterior objects and turns it entirely inward. Picture a medieval household at the end of an ordinary evening. The family has eaten, the fire is banked, the children are in their loft, the husband is asleep, and the wife, always the wife in these accounts because the management of the domestic protective system fell to her, is doing the last checks of the evening. She walks through the cottage. She checks the salt cellar, still sealed, still in its proper place at the center of the table. She checks the bread, right side up, properly covered. She looks at the mirror on the wall, intact, undisturbed. She blows out the last candle, and in that moment of darkness before sleep, she has done everything she can. The kitchen has been read, the objects have been checked, the messages have been received and addressed. The household is to the extent that human care and attention can make it so protected. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense. This was the full-time job of a person who understood that the universe was speaking constantly, and that missing a message could cost everything. Now, picture that same woman waking in the night because something has happened that no amount of salt or bread or mirror checking can prevent. Something that requires no exterior object at all. Something that happened inside her own body. She sneezed, and in the medieval world, that single involuntary reflex was not a minor biological event. It was one of the most spiritually fraught moments a human being could experience, because the body itself, the body you live and that you've been inside every moment of your life, was also a text, and the text could speak at any time, even in the most intimate, most inescapable, most completely private moment of your own physical existence. That is where we're going next. There is something quietly unsettling about the idea that your own body could betray you, not through illness, not through accident, but simply by doing what bodies do and doing it at the wrong moment. That is the world we're stepping into now, a world where the human body itself was not a neutral vessel. It was a surface on which the universe wrote its messages, a canvas of signs, twitches, shivers, and involuntary movements, each one carrying a meaning that a careful observer could read if they knew how. And in medieval Europe, a great many people believed they knew how. Let us start with something so familiar that you probably did it 3 times this week without giving it a second thought. A sneeze. Go ahead and think about the last time you sneezed in a room full of people. What happened? Someone probably said, "Bless you," or "Gesundheit," almost without thinking, a reflexive social courtesy, so automatic that we offer it to total strangers on trains and elevators across conference rooms. Now, here's the question I want you to sit with for a moment. Why? Not in a dismissive way, in a genuinely curious way. Why? Of all the involuntary things a human body can do, cough, hiccup, yawn, stumble, why is the sneeze the one that across dozens of languages and cultures spanning thousands of years still reliably earns a spoken blessing from everyone nearby? The answer takes us straight to the medieval body and its relationship with the invisible world. The history of sneezing as an omen is far older than the Middle Ages. St. Augustine, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, recorded a detail that I find genuinely remarkable. He wrote that in his time, late Roman, early Christian, the fear of sneezing omens was so pervasive that a man would return to bed if he happened to sneeze while putting on his shoes in the morning. Not because he was sick, not because he felt unwell, because the sneeze occurring at that specific moment in the act of preparing to go out into the world was understood as a sign that the day ahead was compromised, that something bad was waiting for him if he continued. So he went back to bed, pulled the covers up, started the morning over. Augustine found this exasperating, to put it mildly. He was a bishop and a theologian, and he thought it was superstitious nonsense. But the fact that he wrote about it with such irritation is itself historical evidence. You do not write with irritation about things that are not happening. He was fighting a real and widespread practice, and the practice had layers. In a medieval understanding of the human body, a sneeze was not simply the nose clearing itself of irritants. It was a rupture, a momentary violent opening of the body to the outside world, a split-second gap in the barrier between your inner self and whatever forces seen or unseen occupied the world around you. 3 distinct fears converged in that single explosive moment. The first was the oldest, that the soul, which was understood to reside within the body connected to it, but not entirely of it, could be shaken loose by the force of a sneeze, expelled through the nose or mouth in a fraction of a second, leaving the body empty and vulnerable for just that one terrifying heartbeat. The second fear was that the devil or any of the lesser demons believed to hover constantly at the edges of human life, looking for a point of entry, could exploit that exact moment of opening. The gasp before the sneeze, the involuntary widening of the mouth, the eyes forced shut. All of it was read as a door, briefly swung open into a room that should stay locked. And the third fear, and this one had a terrible practical grounding, was that a sneeze was one of the first visible symptoms of the plague. In the 6th century, a plague swept through Rome so lethal that people fell dead in the streets mid-sentence. Pope Pelagius II died during that epidemic. One of his notable moments of vulnerability, recorded in the chronicles of the time, was his sneezing. The plague began often with a sudden fever and a sneeze. So bless you in its original form. Diasta adjuit, meaning may God help you, is not just a spiritual courtesy. It was an acknowledgement of mortality. It was the person next to you saying, "I see what that might mean. God be with you." By the year 600, Pope Gregory I had formalized the blessing, encouraging all Christians to invoke God's protection whenever someone in their company sneezed. By the year 750, the practice had become near universal across Christian Europe. We still say it today. Every time you mutter "bless you" to a stranger without thinking, you're carrying a piece of medieval plague terror in your mouth and setting it loose in the air. I find that quietly extraordinary. But the sneeze was only the beginning. Because once you accept the medieval premise that the body is a readable surface, and that involuntary physical events carry meaning, the implications extend to almost every part of your daily existence. Let me give you a few examples that I think will land with real force. Your ears. In medieval folk belief, a burning sensation in the left ear meant someone was speaking ill of you at that very moment. The right ear burning meant the speech was favorable. The logic was elegant in its own way. The soul was porous, connected to the world through the body's openings, and it registered the invisible current of other people's intentions as physical sensation. This is not a fringe belief buried in obscure manuscripts. It appears in folk records across England, France, Germany, the Low Countries. It was so widely held that the 15th century merchant and writer William Caxton, the man who introduced the printing press to England, noted it in his writings without a trace of skepticism, as one notes a well-established fact. Your right thumb twitching. Expect good news. Your left. Something is wrong. The nail on your finger showing a white spot. A gift was coming to you. A yellow spot on the nail. Death was near, itching on the sole of your right foot before journey. The journey would go well. The left foot. Expect delays, obstacles, accidents on the road. And before you smile and think this is all harmless folk fussiness, consider the practical reality of a world where every journey was genuinely uncertain, where roads were dangerous and weather unpredictable and bandits real. In that world, anything that seemed to offer advanced information about what lay ahead was not trivial. It was precious. It was the closest thing available to what we would call a risk assessment. Now here is the aspect of bodily omens that I think is the most psychologically complex and the most revealing of how the medieval mind actually worked. The distinction between the right side and the left side of the body. This was not arbitrary. It ran through almost every bodily omen in the medieval tradition, and it had deep theological roots. The right side was associated with God, with blessing, with the divine order. In the Gospel of Matthew, when the Son of Man separates the saved from the damned, the saved stand on his right hand and the condemned on his left. In iconography throughout the medieval period, Christ raises his right hand in blessing. Saints gesture with their right hands. Angels stand to the right. The left side was the side of shadows of the sinister. And that word sinister, which now just means threatening or ominous, originally meant simply left in Latin. The side of the devil, the side of bad luck. So when a medieval person felt their left eye twitch, they were not just experiencing a minor physical oddity. They were experiencing what felt like a message written in the theological language they had absorbed from birth. Their own body, speaking in a vocabulary provided by the church, telling them that the left-hand side of the divine order was active near them. The body and the cosmos were not separate. The body was the cosmos in miniature. Every twitch, every itch, every involuntary sound or movement was the universe speaking through the most intimate possible channel. You could not get closer to the source of the message than that. And then there were the marks you were born with. This is where the story of bodily omens takes a turn that I want to be honest with you, is genuinely dark. Not in the way that makes for exciting storytelling, but in the way that makes you feel the weight of what fear can do to human beings when it's given enough time and institutional support to develop fully. A birthmark in medieval Europe occupied a strange space between the innocent and the sinister. On one hand, ordinary folk tradition held that birthmarks could be apicious. A mark on the right shoulder might indicate a person destined to carry great burdens honorably. A mark shaped like a crescent could indicate a special relationship with the night and with cycles of change. But from the 13th century onward, as the fear of witchcraft slowly intensified across Europe, building like a slow tide that would crest catastrophically, in the 15th and 16th centuries, that same birthmark began to carry a different possible meaning. The witch hunters had a concept called the devil's mark or the witch's mark. The premise was precise and terrible. When the devil made a pact with a person, he left a physical mark on their body. This mark was proof of the contract, and the mark looked to the untrained like nothing more than an ordinary mole, or an unusual freckle, or a birthmark in an unusual location. The witch finders, who were in many cases men, paid per accused, developed systematic procedures for finding this mark. They stripped the accused, sometimes in public. They examined every inch of skin. They carried long needles, pricking irons they were called, and when they found a suspicious mark, they pressed the needle into it. If the spot did not bleed, or if the person showed no pain, that was accepted as evidence. That was all that was needed, the mark that did not bleed, the spot that felt numb. Never mind that skin numbness has a dozen entirely mundane explanations. Never mind that certain kinds of moles genuinely have reduced nerve sensitivity. Never mind that a person in enough terror stripped naked before a crowd, and knowing their life depends on showing pain, might experience a dissociative numbness that has nothing to do with the devil and everything to do with what extreme fear does to the human nervous system. None of that mattered. The mark was the evidence. The body had confessed. I want to stop here for a moment, because I think this point deserves more than a quick pass. We have been talking about omens as if they are primarily a matter of personal belief, private fears held in individual hearts. And at the level of the ordinary medieval person going about their daily life, they largely were. But the bodily omen, the mark on the skin, the feature of the face, the physical characteristic read as evidence of supernatural allegiance. That is where the private fear became institutional power, where the omen stopped being a thing you saw in the sky and became a thing you saw on another person's body, and where reading that omen could end a life. Let me tell you about a practice that I think illustrates this better than any abstract argument could. By the 15th century, particularly in Germany and the northern countries of Europe, there existed something called physiognomy, the art of reading character and fate in a person's facial features. This was not folk superstition. It had become a scholarly discipline with textbooks and academic proponents claiming that the shape of a nose, the set of the eyes, the structure of the jaw could reveal not only a person's character, but their relationship to the divine order. Heavy eyebrows set close together, a difficult and combative nature possibly given to dark thoughts. Eyes set too close together, cunning and untrustworthy. A forehead that sloped backward at a particular angle predisposed to vice. These were not considered prejudices or intuitions. They were presented as scientific observations derived from the same tradition of natural philosophy that had given the medieval world its understanding of humors of celestial influence on earthly affairs of the body as a microcosm of the cosmic order. The same framework that made a comet a divine message also made your forehead a divine message. You cannot escape it. You could not choose your face. And in a world where the body was read as a text written by forces beyond your control, the features you were born with could be held against you in ways that no amount of virtue or faith could fully overcome. There's one more bodily omen I want to spend time with because it takes us somewhere unexpected into the medieval experience of sleep itself. The medieval night was not the safe private darkness we know. It was a time of genuine danger from sources both practical and supernatural. Fire, cold, illness. These were real enough. But layered over them was the terror of what came in the dark and the space between waking and sleep, where the body was most vulnerable. Medieval people had a word for what we would call sleep paralysis. That terrifying experience of waking in the night to find yourself unable to move, feeling a weight on your chest, sometimes perceiving a shadowy figure standing over you or sitting on your body. They called it the incubus from the Latin word meaning the crusher, and they were absolutely certain of what it was. Not a neurological quirk of the sleeping brain, not the hypnagogic state where the mind hovers between sleep and waking, generating visions. A demon sitting on your chest, pressing the air from your lungs, coming to steal something from you in the dark. The 13th century physician Arnold of Villanova described the experience with a clinical precision that actually maps quite closely onto what we now know. Sleep paralysis involves the person is aware but cannot speak or move. They try to call out, but no sound comes. They feel the weight on their chest as a physical pressure and know it is not a dream, but cannot distinguish it from one. Arnold straddled the line between medical and theological explanation. He acknowledged it might have physiological causes related to the humors, but he did not rule out demonic involvement, because in his world, those two categories were not mutually exclusive. And here's the thing that strikes me about this. If you experience sleep paralysis tonight, as perhaps 1 in 10 people do at some point in their lives, you would probably look it up on your phone in the morning and find a medical explanation within 30 seconds. If you experienced it in 13th century France, you would wake in the morning carrying the memory of a demon that had been in your room on your body in the night. And you would spend the rest of that day wondering what it meant, what it wanted, whether it would come back, and whether the fact that it had visited you at all was itself a sign. This is what I keep returning to the longer I spend with this period of history. The medieval body was never at rest from the work of interpretation. From the moment you woke and sneezed while putting on your shoes to the itch in your left ear, mid-morning to the white spot on your thumbnail, you noticed at dinner to the crushing weight that woke you in the small hours of the night. Your body was generating a continuous stream of data that the medieval mind was trained to read as signal. It was exhausting in a way that I think is hard for us to fully imagine. Not because medieval people were unusually anxious or unusually fearful as individuals. I did not believe that at all. But because the interpretive framework they'd been given by their culture, their church, their families, left no part of the physical world, including their own skin, free of potential meaning. The universe was always speaking, and sometimes it spoke through you. And yet, and this is what I want to leave you with before we move forward, the bodily omens we've been exploring today were in most cases private. You felt the itch. You noticed the mark. You woke from the nightmare. And the question of what it meant was yours to carry, yours to worry about in the quiet of your own mind. The terrible escalation happens when that private reading becomes public, when someone else gets to read your body for you, and when the calendar on the wall, not just the skin on your body, becomes a map of danger. Because there were days in the medieval year that were not simply unlucky, they were forbidden. They were cursed. There were days on which entire communities refused to travel, refused to marry, refused to begin any new venture, days so saturated with accumulated dread that the weight of that fear changed how people move through the world. And one of those days is so deeply embedded in the modern Western mind that you probably still feel a small irrational flicker of something not quite dread, but not quite nothing, whenever the calendar lines up a certain way. A Friday the 13th. The story of how that particular combination of date and day became the most famous piece of bad luck in the Western world is wilder, bloodier, and far more specific than most people know. And it begins in the 14th century before dawn in the great castles of France. So, we have been talking across the last two parts of this story about omens that lived in the body and in the objects of daily life. The sneeze that opened the door to the devil. The left eye that twitched and announced bad news. The salt you knocked over at dinner. The bread you accidentally placed upside down. The mirror you broke in the 7 years that followed. All of these were private things. Things that happened to you in your body, in your home, in the interior life of a single household. But now I want to take you somewhere different, because the most systematically documented, most officially recognized, and in some ways most psychologically oppressive form of medieval bad omen was not written in the behavior of animals or the involuntary reflexes of the body. It was written in the calendar. And once you understood it, once you internalized the system the way every literate medieval European did, you would never look at an ordinary page of dates and months the same way again. Here's a word that has quietly survived from the medieval world into modern English, and almost nobody knows it carries this specific weight. Dismal. You use it to describe a gray morning, a failed project, a particularly depressing Monday, a dismal outcome, a dismal performance, dismal weather. But the word dismal comes directly from the Latin phrase demi, evil days. Specifically, the 24 days every year identified in medieval calendars as the Der Egypti, the Egyptian days on which no sensible person would begin any new project, travel, any significant distance, enter into a business contract, get married, or undergo medical treatment. 24 days a year scattered to a month across every month of the calendar. When the universe's disposition toward human endeavors was considered so inherently hostile that only a fool or the desperately reckless would tempt it, and we turned them into an adjective for a gloomy afternoon. I want to spend some time with the Egyptian days because they are one of the most under-discussed and genuinely fascinating pieces of the medieval omen system. They reveal something important about how medieval culture handled the anxiety of bad omens, not by individual interpretation of random signs, but through a collective officially documented framework that told you in advance which days were dangerous. The list as recorded in medieval calendars across England and continental Europe was precise. The 1st and 25th of January, the 4th and 26th of February, the 1st and 28th of March, the 10th and 20th of April, the 3rd and 25th of May, the 10th and 16th of June, the 13th and 22nd of July, the 1st and 30th of August, the 3rd and 21st of September, the 3rd and 22nd of October, the 5th and 28th of November, the 7th and 22nd of December. 24 dates sitting quietly in the calendar like mines in a field. If you could read, and in the medieval world literacy was a privilege of the clergy, the educated merchant class, and the nobility, these dates were marked in your almanac with a letter D for D's Marley. Evil days. If you could not read, and most medieval people could not, you learned them from the same grandmother who taught you to throw the salt over your shoulder and watch which direction the crow flew. and physicians were especially forbidden from performing bloodletting on these days. In a world where bleeding a patient was the primary medical intervention available for almost every illness, this was not a minor restriction. To let blood on an Egyptian day was to guarantee that the patient would not recover. The day itself would undo whatever the medicine attempted. Now, here's the question I always want to ask when I encounter a belief this specific and this systematic. Where did these particular dates come from? The name Egyptian days points toward one answer. They were supposedly identified by ancient Egyptian astrologers, considered the supreme authorities on celestial matters in the medieval world's inherited classical framework. Some medieval sources claimed these were the dates on which the plagues of Egypt, as described in the book of Exodus, had fallen upon Pharaoh's kingdom. But here is the honest historical truth. Nobody in the medieval world quite knew why these specific 24 dates were cursed. The belief was traditional, which in medieval culture carried its own weight. You knew these days were dangerous because your calendar said so, because your almanac said so, because every physician and farmer and merchant you knew also knew they were dangerous. The historian Keith Thomas, in his landmark study, Religion and the Decline of Magic, captured the medieval church's frustrated relationship with the Egyptian days in a single devastating observation. The church battled against them as superstition for centuries with almost no success because people were afraid of them. Not because they had any reason they could articulate, but because the fear was older than the articulation, and the calendar had given the fear a specific and therefore manageable shape. Here is what I find most psychologically interesting about the Egyptian days. In a world where bad omens were everywhere in the sky, in the animals in the body, the calendar offered something that random signs could not. Predictability. If you knew that the 1st of January was an Egyptian day, you did not have to watch for signs on that morning. You already knew. You had built your plans around it. You'd left no journey starting, no contract signing, no blood to be led on that date. The evil day did not ambush you. You saw it coming weeks in advance, and there is something almost comforting about that in the strangest way. The medieval person with an almanac was not passively at the mercy of the calendar's dangers. They were actively managing them. The omen system, at its most systematic, was not about paralysis. It was about planning. But not every dangerous day in the medieval calendar came with the Egyptian days' impersonal, almost bureaucratic quality. Not every cursed day was simply a mark in an almanac that you navigated like a note on a map reading "Here be dangers." Some days were dangerous because of what had happened on them. And here is where we have to talk about Friday, because Friday, the 6th day of the week, the day named in English after Frigg, the Norse goddess, most closely associated with love and beauty, and in Latin after Venus herself, had in the Christian medieval world become something quite different from a day of love. It had become the day of death. The theology was direct and unavoidable. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified on a Friday. That fact, the most catastrophic event in Christian salvation history, the moment when the Son of God died on a cross, had saturated the 6th day of every week with a weight of suffering that nothing could entirely lift. Everything bad that Christian theology could point to in the biblical narrative seemed to medieval readers to fall on a Friday. The Great Flood in Genesis was said to have begun on a Friday. Cain's murder of Abel was placed by some traditions on a Friday. Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the original catastrophe from which all subsequent human suffering descended, was associated in medieval thought with a Friday. Friday was not just unlucky. Friday was the day the universe had repeatedly chosen to deliver its worst news. And Geoffrey Chaucer, the great poet of medieval English life, writing in the late 14th century in his Canterbury Tales, captured the popular feeling about Friday in a single line that has survived in the scholarly record as perhaps the most concise summary of the medieval attitude toward the day. In the Nun's Priest's Tale, when catastrophe falls upon the unfortunate rooster, Chanterlair sees by the fox chower notes with pointed theatrical irony that all this mischief upon a Friday, not by accident, not by coincidence, because Friday was the day of mischance. In medieval England, public executions were routinely scheduled for Fridays, not because of operational convenience, but because Friday was already the day of endings of judgment of the universe collecting its debts. The condemned prisoners climbed 13 steps to reach the gallows. And there you have it. The two fears sitting side by side in a single weekly occurrence, the day, and the number that would centuries later fuse into one of the most persistent superstitions in the modern Western world. Let me spend a moment with the number 13 before we move forward, because its history in the medieval world is richer and stranger than the simple Last Supper explanation that most people know. The Last Supper connection was real and potent. 13 people at the table, Judas I 13th, betrayal the following morning, Jesus dead by evening. Medieval table etiquette incorporated this belief so completely that the number of dinner guests was tracked with the same vigilance you would give to the lock on your front door. In 15th and 16th century England, some witch hunters claimed that discovering 13 people gathered together was itself evidence of a coven the devil's dozen assembled for dark purposes. But here is the thread from Norse mythology that runs in parallel, and that I find equally revealing about how the number accumulated its dread. The Norse gods gathered for a feast in Valhalla. 12 gods, a perfect and harmonious number, sitting at their great table. And then Loki arrived, the trickster god, the agent of chaos and disruption, uninvited and unstoppable, became the 13th guest. His arrival triggered a sequence of events that ended in the death of Balder, the god of light, beauty, and joy, the most beloved figure in the Norse pantheon. With Balder dead, the world fell into grief. The Norse sources describe the earth weeping. Two great mythological traditions, Hebrew, Christian, and Norse, landing on the same number with the same meaning. 13 was the intruder. 13 was the one too many. 13 was the uninvited presence that disrupted a perfect arrangement and set catastrophe in motion. Now 13 and Friday had existed as separate fears in the medieval world for centuries. Scholars and historians of superstition generally agree that the specific combination Friday the 13th as a single name day of dread did not fully crystallize in Western popular culture until the 19th century at the earliest, and really gained its modern shape from a 1907 American novel by a writer named Thomas Lawson. But I want to argue that this timeline, while accurate, misses something important. The combination may be modern, but the components are medieval through and through. Every element that makes Friday the 13th feel ominous. The weight of Friday as the day of execution and crucifixion. The weight of 13 as the number of betrayal and catastrophe. The accumulated anxiety around specific calendar dates as carriers of ill fortune. All of that material was shaped in the medieval world and deposited in the Western imagination like sediment in a riverbed. And when the 19th century combined the components, it was not inventing something new. It was discovering a structure that had been waiting assembled and ready for someone to name it. Here's what I want you to really sit with, because I think it illuminates something that goes beyond the specific history of any single superstition. The Egyptian days were 24 specific dates marked in every literate person's almanac on which the universe's disposition was officially collectively authoritatively documented as hostile. The 3 cursed Mondays, the last Monday of April, the second Monday of August, the last Monday of December were dates so widely known that the church spent generations trying to replace them with saints' feast days and failed. Friday was the weekly day of endings, the day of the gallows, and the crucifixion baked into the name of the day itself in the Norse tradition that had given English its vocabulary. And 13 was the number of betrayal of disruption of the one presence too many that turns a harmonious gathering into a catastrophe. All of these were not random fears. They were a coherent system, a system that said time itself is not neutral. Some moments carry the weight of accumulated bad events. Some configurations of day and number and season are genuinely more dangerous than others, not because the mathematics of the calendar has changed, but because human history has written on those moments, and the writing does not erase. The medieval world was not afraid of time in general. It was afraid of specific time, named time, documented, calendared, almanac marked letter D time. And here's the twist that I cannot help but love. The word dismal, the word we use today for gray skies and failed projects and gloomy November afternoons, comes from those 24 dates, Demali, evil days. Every time you describe a rainy Monday as dismal, you are speaking medieval Latin. Every time you feel that faint, irrational hesitation before a Friday the 13th, you are carrying the medieval calendar's weight forward through time. Not because you believe in Egyptian astrologers or Norse gods or the theology of the crucifixion in any systematic way, but because the calendar, once it has absorbed this much historical anxiety, does not easily let it go. The dates learned their meanings in the medieval world, and they kept them. Which brings us at last to the most specific, most historically grounded, most dramatically documented Friday the 13th in all of medieval history. A morning in October of 137, pre-dawn, royal soldiers moving through the streets of Paris with sealed orders, and a group of men who had spent generations as the most trusted, most powerful, most spiritually and militarily formidable organization in Christendom, who had absolutely no idea what was coming. Because even with all their knowledge, even with all their wealth, even with all their connections to the highest levels of church and crown, the Knights Templar had not read the signs. And when a Friday the 13th decides to speak, when the calendar and history and political betrayal all arrive on the same morning, the message it delivers tends to be one that no amount of protective charm or almanac reading could have prepared anyone for. That is the story we're telling next. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. When was the last time you looked at a calendar and noticed it was the 13th? And did you feel anything, even the faintest ghost of something you could not quite name, when you saw it land on a Friday? Be honest with yourself, because research suggests that somewhere between 17 and 21 million Americans still report experiencing genuine anxiety on Friday the 13th. Not rational, debilitating fear, just that quiet, low-level unease. A slight preference for staying home. A small private relief when nothing goes wrong. That feeling, that invisible thread connecting your nervous system to a day on the calendar, is nearly 700 years old. And the story of how it got there begins not with superstition, but with one of the most audacious, cold-blooded, and meticulously planned acts of political betrayal in all of medieval history. To understand what happened on the morning of Friday the 13th of October 137, you first need to understand who the Knights Templar were, because they were not the shadowy, mysterious figures of Hollywood conspiracy thrillers. They were for almost 2 centuries one of the most extraordinary institutions in the medieval world. Founded in 1119 on Christmas Day, originally as a small band of knights sworn to protect Christian pilgrims, traveling the dangerous roads to Jerusalem, the Order of the Temple grew with a speed that seemed almost miraculous to those who witnessed it. Within a generation, they had become one of the most formidable military forces in Europe. Disciplined, devoted, battle-hardened, sworn to poverty and chastity as individual members, yet collectively wealthy beyond almost any institution on the continent. And here is the detail that most people miss. The Templars were also, in a very real sense, the inventors of modern banking. When a wealthy pilgrim wanted to travel to the Holy Land without carrying sacks of gold through bandit-infested roads, the Templars offered him a solution of elegant simplicity. He deposited his gold at a Templar house in France or England. He received a letter of credit, a coded document that could only be read with the right key. He traveled safely. He arrived in Jerusalem and presented the letter to the Templar house there. He received his gold. We call it a letter of credit. The Templars called it a practical solution to a practical problem. And because they were trusted by virtually every monarch and nobleman in Christendom, trusted as warriors, trusted as bankers, trusted as men who could not be bribed because their individual vow of poverty meant they personally kept nothing, they became indispensable, which meant that by the early 14th century, a great many powerful people owed the Templars very significant amounts of money, including Philip IV of France. Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, which referred to his appearance rather than his character, was a man of extraordinary political intelligence and, to put it gently, a flexible relationship with moral scruple. He had already in the years before 137 demonstrated a pattern that was becoming familiar to those who watched French royal finances. When he needed money and owed debts he preferred not to pay, he found a way to eliminate the creditor. In 1291, he moved against the Lombard banking families. In 136, he expelled every Jewish person from France and confiscated their property and outstanding loans. Both times the same elegant logic. If the creditor no longer exists, the debt no longer exists. By 137, Philip owed the Templars enormous sums. The exact figure varies in different historical sources, but historians agree it was substantial. The product of decades of royal borrowing for wars dowies and the general extravagance that had made Philip's court one of the most expensive in Europe. And the Templars, unlike the Lombards or the Jewish communities of France, were not simply wealthy. They were militarily powerful. They answered not to Philip, but to the Pope. They had castles. They had trained soldiers. They had international networks stretching from the British Isles to the eastern Mediterranean. You could not simply arrest them on a Tuesday morning. You had a plan, and Philip planned with extraordinary chilling care. The secret orders went out on the 14th of September 137. Exactly 1 month before the strike was meant to fall, every royal official in France received the same sealed document, with the same instruction: do not open until the appointed moment. Inside, sealed with the royal authority of the French crown, were detailed instructions for what was to happen in every district of France simultaneously at dawn on the 13th of October. Every Templar in France was to be arrested. Every Templar property was to be seized. Every Templar asset was to be inventoried and confiscated in the name of the crown. Historians estimate that somewhere around 15,000 men, knight sergeants, chaplain, servants, laborers who worked the Templar estates were taken in a single coordinated sweep. Only about 24 managed to escape before the net closed. Jacques de Mole, the Grand Master of the entire order, was in Paris on the 12th of October, 137. He had been a pallbearer at the funeral of Catherine of Courtenay, the sister-in-law of King Philip himself. He shared a meal with the king. He had no idea. The next morning, before sunrise, the soldiers came. Now, the charges Philip brought against the Templars were breathtaking in their audacity. Not financial malfeasance, not failure to repay debts. That would have been too obvious, too clearly motivated by greed to carry the moral weight Philip needed. Instead, he accused them of heresy, of devil worship, of rituals so depraved denying Christ spitting on the cross, engaging in secret ceremonies that his agents describe with a salacious detail, clearly designed to shock and disgust that the entire order had to be destroyed as a matter of Christian duty. Philip sent these accusations in detailed written form to every court in Christendom. He wanted the world to know what the Templars had supposedly done. Pope Clement V, who had himself been elected largely through Philip's influence, and whose papacy was based not in Rome, but an avenue inside France, where the French king's pressure was a daily reality, was initially horrified by the arrests. He wrote to Philip, furious that the king had acted outside his authority by arresting men who answered to the church. But then the confessions started arriving. Confession after confession, extracted from Templar knights in the dungeons of French prisons, describing in elaborate detail the heretical rituals Philip had promised to expose. What the confessions did not mention, because the men writing them down had good reasons to omit the detail, was the method by which those confessions had been obtained. A Templar knight named Bernard Detto survived his interrogation and later described what had been done to him. His feet, he said, had been coated in fat and held over open flames until the flesh burned away. He said that later 2 pieces of bone fell from his heels, which he presented to the investigators as evidence of what had happened. The strapardo was another common method. The prisoner's wrists were bound behind his back. A rope looped over a beam above, and the prisoner hoisted off the ground, then suddenly dropped his full weight caught before he hit the floor by the rope, dislocating his shoulders and snapping the tendons in his arms. Subjected to these methods, the overwhelming majority of the knights confessed to everything they were asked to confess to. Many of them, when released from the immediate threat of torture and brought before church investigators, immediately recanted. They said they had confessed to things that never happened. They begged to be heard. Philip's response to the retractions was to burn 54 of them alive at the stake outside Paris in May of 1310 as a demonstration of what happened to relapsed heretics. After that, most of the surviving Templars stopped recanting. The order was formally dissolved by papal decree on the 22nd of March, 1312 at the Council of Vienne. Whatever assets Philip had not already absorbed were technically handed to the rival order, the Hospitallers, though Philip managed to ensure that a significant portion of the cash remained conveniently within France. 2 years later, in the spring of 1314, the last act was played out. Jacques de Mole, master of the Knights Templar, had spent 7 years in a Paris prison. He was approximately 70 years old. He and his companion Jedichan were brought to a small island in the middle of the river San, the Isle de Jif. It was called the Isle of the Jews and tied to stakes. And here is where history and legend converge in one of the most remarkable passages in all of medieval storytelling. As the flames began, Dima reportedly spoke. The exact words vary across the sources, and historians acknowledge the difficulty of separating what was actually said from what was later attributed to him by chroniclers who found the story irresistible. But the essence documented in multiple contemporary accounts was this. He called out that God would avenge the order's innocence. He summoned both Pope Clement and King Philip to join him before the judgment of God within the year. Then the flames took him. Pope Clement V died 33 days later on the 20th of April, 1314. King Philip IV died before the year was out of a stroke while hunting. And then in the 14 years that followed, all three of Philip's sons who succeeded him as King of France died in rapid succession. Within 14 years of Demise's death, the royal house of Cape, which had ruled France for 300 years without interruption, had collapsed entirely. Whether this sequence of deaths was Demel's curse, God's judgment, biological coincidence, or simply the mortality that comes for everyone eventually, that is a question the medieval mind would have found very easy to answer. And the medieval mind's answer is by now entirely predictable. There are no coincidences. Everything means something. The Grand Master spoke and the universe listened. Now, here's the piece of honest historical complexity that I want to make sure we do not skip past. The direct, documented connection between the arrest of the Templars in 137 and the specific modern superstition of Friday, I-13th is, and I say this, as someone who finds the Templar story genuinely extraordinary, not quite as clean as the popular version suggests. The fear of Friday as a generally unlucky day is genuinely medieval. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, warned in the Canterbury Tales against beginning journeys or enterprises on a Friday. In medieval England, public executions were routinely scheduled for Fridays. The day of the crucifixion of Christ falls on a Friday, which gave it a theological weight of suffering and catastrophe that permeated the entire medieval calendar. The fear of the number 13 is also genuinely ancient, rooted in the Last Supper, reinforced by Norse mythology story of Loki as the uninvited 13th guest at a divine feast, compounded by the association of 13 with a number of witches needed to form a coven. The specific combination of these two fears into the particular dread of Friday the 13th as a single-named calendar marked day of bad luck that appears in popular culture relatively late, really gaining its modern form in the 19th century. What the Templar story did was give that already existing anxiety its most vivid, most specific, most dramatically satisfying historical anchor. An event so shocking, so specific, so loaded with power and betrayal, and subsequent tragedy that it became the story people reached for when they wanted to explain why the combination of that day and that number carried such weight. And the fact that it may not be the clean causal origin does not make it less historically meaningful, because this is exactly how bad omens worked in the medieval world, and if we're being honest, how they still work in the modern one. We do not invent our fears from nothing. We inherit them. We attach them to stories. The story may not be the literal cause of the fear, but it becomes the container that holds the fear in shape, passing it from generation to generation with a weight and a specificity that make it feel to each successive person who encounters it like something real. Something that I find worth sitting with is the sheer scale of what Philip accomplished. He destroyed one of the most powerful, most respected, and most militarily capable institutions in medieval Christendom. He extracted confessions through methods that bear every hallmark of systematic coercion rather than genuine guilt. He silenced the men who tried to recant. He burned his most credible witnesses. And in the end, he got what he wanted. The debts disappeared. The properties changed hands. The Templars ceased to exist. And yet, what survived? What outlasted his dynasty? What outlasted his kingdom? What in some sense outlasted his entire civilization was not his victory. It was Demolay's curse. Or rather, it was the story of Demolay's curse which medieval people told and retold, because it satisfied the deepest requirement of the medieval moral imagination. The universe was just. The signs were real. The powerful could not escape the consequences of their crimes simply because they had the power to destroy the evidence and silenced the witnesses. The comet appeared. The bad omen was fulfilled. Not immediately, not conveniently, but eventually, and in ways that went beyond the merely personal collapsing an entire royal dynasty within a single generation. To the medieval mind, this was not coincidence. This was the universe taking its time, but keeping its word. One more thing before we move on, and it is the thing I keep returning to every time I think about this story. Jacques de Mole, on the morning of the 12th of October 137, shared a meal with the king who was about to destroy him. He walked out of that meal, went to bed in his Paris house, and had no idea. The next dawn the soldiers came. There is something in that image, the meal, the conversation, the complete absence of warning that feels almost unbearably human. Here was a man whose entire world operated on the premise that signs exist, that God communicates through events, that the attentive person can read the universe's intentions before they fully materialize. And yet the most consequential moment of his life arrived with no omen at all. No raven on the roof, no candle that flickered wrong, no dream that warned him, just dawn and then soldiers at the door. I'm not sure what to do with that detail, honestly. It sits in me uncomfortably the way the best historical details always do. The medieval system of signs and warnings which promised that the careful observer could know what was coming, and the reality that sometimes the catastrophe simply arrives in the dark before any sign has a chance to speak. And yet the medieval world did not give up on the signs. Not after the Templars, not after the plague, not after any of the disasters that arrived without warning across those long and terrible centuries. Because what would it mean to give up on the signs? It would mean accepting that the universe is random, that suffering has no cause, that the future is entirely opaque. And for most of human history, and perhaps for most of human nature, that is an unbearable conclusion. Better to have omens that sometimes fail than no omens at all. Better to read the signs and occasionally be wrong than to live in a world that does not speak. Which brings us at last to the place in this story where the fear of bad omens stopped being something people simply endured and became something they tried with terrible consequences to weaponize. Because once you accept the principle that bad omens reveal hidden evil, that the universe flags the wicked through signs and symptoms, the next question becomes almost inevitable. What do we do about the people the signs point to? What do we do about the woman whose cat crosses your path? The man whose face Phisome says cannot be trusted? The person in the wrong place when the comet appeared? What do we do about the ones the omens accuse? The answer to that question consumed more innocent lives than any plague in the entire medieval period. And it begins with a word. A single terrible word that once spoken could not be taken back. Which something shifts in this story. Now, up until this point, we've been talking about bad omens as a system of interpretation, a lens through which medieval people read the world around them. Signs in the sky, signs in animals, signs in the body, signs in the calendar. All of it in a sense at a slight remove from the immediate and physical. But there is a moment in medieval history when the bad omen stopped being something you watch from a distance. When it walked into your city, when it knocked on your neighbor's door, when you woke one morning and realized it had already been in your house for 3 days wearing the face of someone you loved. That moment arrived in October of 1347 at the port of Messina in Sicily. 12 ships from the Black Sea docked in the harbor. The people who came down to the docks expecting to unload cargo found something different. Most of the sailors on those ships were dead. The ones still alive were covered in black swellings. Enormous grotesque buboes in the armpits and groin that oozed blood and fluid. Their skin was mottled. Their breath was labored. They were covered in dark blotches where the blood had gathered under the skin. Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. It was far too late. Let me give you the numbers first, because I think they need to be spoken plainly before we can really understand what the experience of this catastrophe was like. Before the Black Death, Europe's population was somewhere around 75 million people. By the time the first wave subsided around 1350, somewhere between 25 and 50 million of them were dead. Historians' estimates vary, but the median figure most scholars use is that roughly 1/3 of Europe's entire population died in approximately 5 years. To put that in terms that might feel more immediate, imagine losing 1 out of every 3 people you know. Your closest friend, your mother, 1/3 of your colleagues, 1/3 of your neighbors, 1/3 of your city. Not gradually, over decades, in 5 years. And then the plague came back in 1361, 1369, 1374. It returned again and again across the following 3 centuries, less catastrophically than the first wave, but relentlessly each generation watching for its return with the vigilance of people who had learned that this particular horror could arrive without warning on any merchant ship from the east. England's population, which had stood at perhaps 6 million before 1347, did not return to that level until the 16th century. 200 years to recover. And here's what I want you to understand about what this experience did to the entire system of omens and signs and divine messages that we've been exploring in this story. It did not destroy it. It amplified it. Because when something this catastrophic happens, when suffering arrives on a scale that exceeds any previous frame of reference, the human mind does not conclude that the universe is meaningless. The human mind concludes that the signal was there and it was missed, that the signs were present all along and nobody read them correctly, or nobody listened, or the sins that provoked the disaster were so widespread and so deep that no individual act of attention could have prevented the catastrophe. Every bad omen that the medieval world had already developed, every crow, every candle, every sleepless night, every spot on the thumbnail was now running on a background of absolute terror. The stakes of misreading were no longer bad luck or personal misfortune. They were death in 3 to 5 days of a disease so aggressive that healthy people went to bed at night and were dead by morning. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Florentine writer, who lived through the plague of 1348 and wrote about it with an honesty that still reads as raw and immediate nearly 700 years later, described what the city became. He wrote of people abandoning their homes, wandering the streets without purpose, avoiding all human contact, because every human being was a potential death sentence. He described how neighbors stopped visiting neighbors, how families stopped gathering, how brothers abandoned brothers, uncles abandoned, nephews, sisters abandoned sisters. And then the sentence that I find even now genuinely difficult to sit with. Fathers and mothers, he wrote, abandoned their own children, left them in the house, uncared for, unvisited, as if they were strangers. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was the terror of people who had learned within a few weeks that the very impulse to comfort the dying, to hold them, to pray over them, to sit beside them in their final hours was the act most likely to kill you next. The physicians who visited the sick came home sick. The priests who took confessions at the deathbed died, taking the next confession. The monks who carried bodies to mass graves were themselves carried to mass graves within days. In some parts of Italy, chroniclers recorded that the only people who would work as gravediggers for any amount of payment were those who had survived the plague once and believed, hoped, prayed that surviving it once meant surviving it again. Now, in this context, ask yourself, what would a bad omen mean to a person living inside this experience? Think about the sneeze which we discussed before. In ordinary medieval life, a sneeze was a spiritual event, a momentary rupture in the body's defenses, a possible sign of danger to come. In a city where the plague was moving house to house, block by block, and one of its first symptoms was a sudden onset of fever, sometimes accompanied by respiratory distress. A sneeze was no longer a spiritual sign. A sneeze was a death sentence. If you sneezed in the spring of 1348 in Florence and Paris, in London, the people around you did not say, "God bless you," and move on. They moved back. Their eyes changed. And the question that settled into the room, silent and terrible, was not, did the devil get in it? Is this it? Is this the one that kills us all? Every bad omen that had previously operated as a source of anxiety now operated as a source of what we would today recognize as acute collective trauma. The language of signs and portents did not disappear. If anything, it intensified, but the texture of the fear it described changed completely. The medical understanding of the plague in the 14th century was by our standards completely wrong, but it was wrong in ways that made absolute sense within its own framework. The dominant medical theory of the time held that disease was caused by an imbalance of the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that this imbalance could be triggered by miasma, meaning poisoned or corrupted air. Bad air rising from rotting matter swamps, unburied bodies could alter the humoral balance and cause illness. So the immediate medical response to the plague was to burn aromatic herbs, carry flowers and perfume close to the face when moving through the city, and avoid any area where the air smelled foul. People walked through plague-stricken streets, holding bouquets of roses and lavender to their noses, believing the scent was protective. There is a children's rhyme, you know it, the historians have sometimes connected to this practice, though the actual origin is debated. Ring around the roses, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. But here's the thing about the miasma theory, which I want to hold up for a moment, because it says something important about the relationship between omens and explanations. The medieval physicians who promoted miasma theory were not simply making things up. They were observing the world carefully and noticing real correlations. Areas with poor sanitation and rotting organic matter did have higher rates of disease, not because of bad air, as it turned out, but because those same conditions bred the fleas and rats that carried the actual pathogen. The observation was accurate. The causal chain was wrong. Bad air in a marsh correlates with disease. Therefore, bad air causes disease. The logic is flawed, but the logic is not unreasonable given what we're available to know. And this, I think, is one of the most important things the plague teaches us about the entire world of medieval omens. The people reading these signs were often observing genuine correlations. The crow that appears before a death does not cause the death, but crows are drawn to places where something is dying, so the correlation is real. The candle that sputters in a sick room does, so, because the air in the room has changed, because breathing has consumed more oxygen, because the room is closed, because someone in it is fighting for their life. The omen reader was not imagining things. They were just drawing the wrong conclusion from a real observation in the absence of the tools that would have let them draw the right one. But the miasma theory was only one of the explanations medieval people reached for when the plague arrived, and it was in many ways the most scientific, the one that at least tried to ground itself in observable physical causes. The other explanations were theological, and they were in the medieval framework, both more powerful and more psychologically devastating. The plague was God's punishment for sin. This was not a fringe position. It was the near universal consensus of the Catholic Church and its representatives across Europe. The chronicles of the period are full of it. The plague was the judgment of God upon a sinful people. The book of Revelation had warned that pestilence was one of the signs of the end times. Medieval scholars pointed to specific passages, the plagues of Egypt, the destruction of Sodom, the prophetic books where God threatens entire peoples with disease for their collective moral failure, and read the Black Death as the fulfillment of those warnings written across an entire continent. And the implication of this reading was devastating in a very specific way. Because if the plague was punishment for sin, if it was God's response to human wickedness, then the question of why one person died and the person next to them survived was also a theological question. Why did God spare you? Were you more righteous than your neighbor who died? Were you less sinful than the priest who collapsed to the deathbed? Was your survival a sign of divine favor, or simply God's decision to leave you alive long enough to repent? And if you sinned, if you had unconfessed sins on your soul, which virtually every medieval person believed they did, was the bowing under your arm, the universe finally collecting its debt? There is a movement that emerged from this theological interpretation that I want to spend some time with because it is one of the most visually striking and psychologically revealing phenomena the plague produced. The flagellants, groups of men, sometimes hundreds of them, traveling together, sometimes thousands who moved from town to town across Europe, publicly beating themselves with leather straps and whips. The practice had existed in Christianity before the plague as a form of penitential self-discipline. But in the context of the Black Death, it transformed into something far more extreme and far more public. Groups would arrive in a town, gather in the central square stripped to the waist, and beat themselves rhythmically. Some accounts say 3 times a day each session, lasting approximately as long as it took Christ to hang on the cross, calculated by one contemporary source at 33.5 hours over 11 days of processing. The leather straps were often knotted and tipped with metal points designed to cut the skin. The participants' backs by the end of the pilgrimage were raw and deeply scarred. They sang specific hymns as they beat themselves. They processed in organized formation. They had leaders who called out the rhythm of the blows, and they believed with absolute conviction that this was doing something. Not symbolic penance, not spiritual discipline, actual divine intervention. That the blood they shed voluntarily, offered freely consciously, with the specific intention of absorbing God's wrath and redirecting, it was actively protecting the towns they visited from the plague's worst consequences. They were reading the plague as the ultimate bad omen, the final massive signal of divine displeasure, and responding to it the way the medieval interpretive system demanded by finding the sin, confessing it, suffering for it, and hoping the suffering was enough to turn the universe's verdict. Pope Clement V/VI eventually condemned the flagellant movement in the summer of 1349 partly because its leaders were becoming increasingly independent of church authority, and partly because it was generating dangerous social disorder. But the fact that it needed to be condemned, that it had grown large enough to require a papal bull to suppress, tells you everything about the psychological state of a continent, facing a catastrophe it could not explain or control. And then there is the dimension of the plague that I find most personally difficult to sit with quietly, because the theological explanation, the plague, as divine punishment for sin required not only personal penance, but also in the minds of many the identification of the specific human agents through whom the punishment was being delivered. God's wrath needed a vessel. In the context of medieval Europe in 1347 and 1348, the community that was identified as that vessel was the Jewish population. Rumors spread and spread with terrifying speed, and were believed with terrifying ease that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning the wells that Christian communities drank from. There was no evidence for this. Pope Clement V/VI explicitly stated in a papal bull issued in 1348 that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, which made no sense if Jews were responsible for spreading it. He forbade violence against them and threatened excommunication for those who attacked Jewish communities. It made no difference. Between 1348 and 1350, Jewish communities in hundreds of European cities were attacked. In some cities, Strasbourg, Mainz, Frankfurt, entire communities were destroyed. Historians estimate that more than 300 Jewish communities were eliminated in the aftermath of the Black Death. Strasbourg in February of 1349 presents one of the most documented cases. The city council had refused to participate in the violence, arguing there was no evidence of Jewish guilt. A new council was elected specifically to authorize the action. On St. Valentine's Day, 1349, approximately 2,000 Jewish men, women, children in Strasbourg were gathered in the Jewish cemetery and burned alive. The plague did not stop after that, but the need to read the omen to identify the cause, to find the agent of divine punishment, and eliminate it was stronger than the evidence. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it is the darkest and most important part of everything we've been exploring in this entire story. We began with a very human desire to find meaning in a world of random suffering, to believe that the universe speaks, that signs exist, that if you are attentive enough and careful enough, you can know what is coming and perhaps prepare for it. This desire is not evil. It is not stupid. It is, as I said at the very beginning of this story, one of the most human things there is. But the plague reveals what happens when that desire operates without the corrective of careful, honest inquiry. When the need to explain is stronger than the commitment to explaining correctly. When the emotional urgency of this must mean something overrides the discipline of asking. But does the evidence actually support this meaning? The plague was a bad omen. It was the universe speaking in a language so loud that no one could miss it. But medieval Europe, by and large, heard the message wrong. It looked for the human agents of divine punishment rather than the biological agents of bacterial infection. And the people who suffered most from that misreading were not the sinners the system theoretically accused. They were the people the system had already decided to distrust. What the plague did not do, and this is important, is destroy the faith of most of the people who survived it. What it did was reorganize and intensify that faith in ways that would echo through European culture for the next 2 centuries. The dance macabre, the dance of death, became one of the defining artistic motifs of the late medieval period. Images painted on church walls across Europe showing skeletons leading people from every rank of society, king, bishop, merchant, peasant, in an inescapable procession toward the grave. The message was blunt, and democratic death comes for everyone. No rank exempts you. No wealth protects you. No virtue guarantees survival. Every surviving person in post-plague Europe had watched the system fail, had watched priests die, had watched prayers go unanswered, had watched the good die alongside the sinful, the pious alongside the corrupt. And yet they rebuilt. They had children. They planted crops. They repopulated the empty villages. They went to church, because the alternative, accepting that the world was random, that death had no meaning, that the universe was indifferent, was unbearable. Better to live in a world that spoke to you, even when the message was terrible. Better to have omens that sometimes got it wrong than to live under a sky that said nothing at all. We come a long way in this story. From a medieval mind's first principles about a universe that speaks through the birds and the black cats and the bodily twitches and the cursed calendar dates, all the way to the catastrophe that tested every one of those principles to their absolute breaking point. And the system held, battered, reshaped, sometimes turned to monstrous ends, but held because the need it served was not intellectual. It was emotional. It was the need to feel that the suffering meant something, that the chaos had a shape, that the universe, for all its terror, was not indifferent. But there is one more piece of this story that we have not yet fully explored. And it is perhaps the strangest piece of all, because everything we have discussed so far has been about how ordinary people, farmers, merchants, priests, pilgrims, navigated the world of bad omens. We have not yet talked about what happened when the people who were supposed to be above omens, the people whose divine mandate was supposed to make them immune to the universe's darker messages, found themselves confronting signs they could not ignore. The kings, and specifically a king who received a bad omen and refused it. A king who watched the signs pile up against him and dismissed them one by one. A king who had every reason to believe the universe was warning him and chose to believe otherwise. That choice and what followed from it is one of the most quietly devastating stories in all of medieval history. Of all the layers of the medieval omen system we've explored, the celestial signs, the animal messengers, the bodily twitches, the cursed calendar, there is one layer that operated on a completely different scale. Because most omens were private things. They happened to you, to your family, to your village, the raven on your rooftop, the salt you spilled at dinner, the dream that woke you at midnight. But when a bad omen touched a king, when the universe appeared to direct its message not at a farmer or a merchant, but at the anointed representative of God on earth, then everything changed. The stakes were no longer personal. They were civilizational. To understand why, you have to understand what medieval kings actually were in the minds of their subjects. Not just rulers, not simply powerful men who commanded armies and collected taxes and issued laws. They were, in the medieval theological framework, something fundamentally different from ordinary human beings. Every medieval king of England and France, and this was not metaphor, this was genuinely believed, was anointed with sacred oil during their coronation. Not ordinary oil. Oil believed to have been divinely provided in some traditions, traced back to holy relics. In others, simply understood as consecrated by God's grace through the archbishop who administered it. This anointing in the medieval mind changed the king physically. It transferred something from the divine realm into his body. It was why the king's touch was believed to heal disease, not as pageantry, not as theater, but as a genuine theological reality. The king's hands, once anointed, carried the healing power of God. The sick, who came to be touched by an English or French monarch, were not merely seeking symbolic comfort. They believed they were seeking actual divine intervention administered through an anointed human intermediary. Edward the Confessor, who ruled England from 1042 to 1066, was credited with beginning this practice in England. Chronicles describe him touching patients suffering from scrula, the painful serrating tubercle inflammation of the lymph nodes, and the disease responding. Whether those specific accounts are accurate in detail is historically uncertain. What is not uncertain is that for the next 6 centuries, every monarch of England touched for the king's evil, as it was called in formal ceremonies, where sometimes hundreds of sick people stood in line to receive the royal hand. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, that most magnificently theatrical of all European monarchs, reportedly touched 1,600 people in a single Easter ceremony. 1,600 people, all of them believing that God was operating through the king's hand. Now, Here's the question that this framework raises, and it is the question I want to spend the rest of this part of our story with. If the king was God's anointed representative on earth, if he carried divine blessing in his very flesh, then what did it mean when bad omens clustered around him? What did it mean when the universe turned its darker signs not toward the peasantry in the fields, but toward the throne itself? The medieval answer was both theologically sophisticated and psychologically devastating. It meant one of two things. Either the king had sinned grievously and God was sending warnings as he had sent warnings to the sinful kings of the Old Testament. Or, and this was the more dangerous possibility, the man sitting on the throne was not the legitimate king at all. Because a king who lacked God's blessing could not by definition receive God's positive signs. A usurper or a tyrant or a king who had violated the sacred trust of his anointing would be marked not by divine favor, but by divine warning. The bad omen in the royal context was not just a personal misfortune, it was a political argument. Let me tell you about a boy who became King of England in July of 1377 at the age of 10 years old. His name was Richard, and his coronation at Westminster Abbey on the 16th of July was, even by the standards of the period, richly steeped in omen and portent from the very beginning. The boy had been rushed to the throne just 11 days after his grandfather's funeral, in part because there were genuine fears that the power vacuum left by the old king's death might be exploited by Richard's Uncle John of Gaunt. The speed was deliberate, a political necessity dressed as sacred ceremony, and the ceremony itself, almost from its first moment, started going wrong in ways that those watching with careful eyes could not help but notice. Richard was 10 years old. He was, by the accounts of those present, exhausted by the time the actual coronation began, having participated the previous day in an elaborate procession on horseback from the Tower of London to Westminster, through streets packed with thousands of spectators. By the time the sacred oils has been applied, the crown had been set on his small head, and the archbishop had said the ancient words, the child king was barely conscious. His tutor, Simon Burley, had to carry him from Westminster Abbey on his shoulders. And as Burley carried him, the newly crowned King of England, 10 years old, slumped against his tutor's neck. One of Richard's shoes slipped from his foot and fell to the ground. Not just any shoe, the sacred coronation slipper part of the regalia, the symbolic footwear of a divinely anointed king. And one contemporary chronicler, Adam Musk, recorded this moment with a precision that tells you exactly how the medieval mind processed it. He wrote that the loss of the slipper foretold the loss of the kingdom. Not this is perhaps an awkward moment. Not the child was tired. Not shoes fall off of children's feet all the time. The slipper fell. Therefore, a sign had been given. And the sign, when all was said and done, proved not to be wrong. Richard II grew from that exhausted 10-year-old into one of the most fascinating, most troubled, and most thoroughly omen-haunted monarchs in English history. He was also, and this is historically documented, with real specificity, a man who believed in omens and prophecies with unusual intensity, even by the standards of his own time. Historians note that surviving astrological horoscopes exist for virtually every later medieval English king, from Edward II onward. The consultation of astrologers was not considered shameful or irreligious by medieval royalty. It was practical. The stars were part of God's communication system, and a king who ignored them was not pious. He was negligent. But Richard went further than most. He was influenced by a specific prophetic text, a work known as the Verses of Gildas, originally composed in the 1320s. This text predicted that a great English king would arise to conquer Ireland, then go on to victories in Scotland, Gascony, France, Spain, Egypt, and eventually reclaim the Holy Land for Christendom. Richard became convinced, or was convinced by his advisors, that he was this king, that the prophecy was about him, which is, I want to point out, gently exactly the kind of belief that makes a man enormously vulnerable to the particular psychological blow of things not going according to prophecy. Because the medieval omen system operated in both directions. The signs that confirmed your divine mandate were wonderful, but the signs that contradicted it, the shoes that fell, the ships that wrecked the hermits who warned you, the comets that blazed in the wrong season, those signs had a power proportional to how confidently you believed in the positive ones. In the spring of 1399, a hermit was brought before King Richard II. A hermit, a wandering religious ascetic, the kind of man who lived outside the structures of ordinary society, and whose marginal position gave him a strange kind of authority in the medieval imaginations, the kind of authority that came precisely from having nothing to lose. This hermit looked at the king and delivered a message that was, diplomatically speaking, catastrophically ill-timed. He berated Richard. He told the king to amend his ways. He warned him that if he did not change course, such dire news would shortly come his way, as he had never read nor seen. Richard, unmoved by this performance, had the hermit imprisoned in the Tower of London. Not long afterward, Richard departed on campaign to Ireland, and while he was gone, his cousin Henry of Bolingbroke, whom Richard had previously banished from England, landed with an army on the English coast. The lords who might have resisted rallied to Henry instead. On the 1st of October, 1399, it was over. Richard II, the king, who had been carried from his own coronation with one shoe, who had believed himself destined for the greatest glory prophecy could offer, was formally deposed. He died in prison the following year. What happened to the hermit history does not record. Let me ask you something now, and I want you to really sit with it. Do you think Richard II in his prison cell at Pontefract Castle thought about the shoe, about the hermit, about all the signs he had either missed or chosen to interpret in his favor? I'm not asking whether those signs actually caused his downfall. They did not. His downfall was caused by real political miscalculations, real constitutional crises, real violations of the expectations of his nobility. But in the medieval interpretive system, the system he had grown up inside, the system he believed in, every one of those signs was a sentence in a language the universe had been speaking to him for years, and he had not listened, or he had listened and heard what he wanted to hear. There is something in this story that I find quietly universal and deeply human. The capacity to read the signs that confirm what we already believe, and to dismiss or rationalize the signs that challenge it. Richard was not unique in this. He was doing something that every human being does in every century. But the medieval framework made the consequences of that selective reading visible in a way that our modern world, with its more private belief systems, often obscures. Now, let me bring you to the other side of this equation. Because where Richard II represents the king who believed in omens, believed in them deeply, and yet somehow failed to hear the ones that mattered most, there is another story entirely. The story of what happened when a king became the omen. Edward the Confessor. The king who first began the tradition of the royal touch in England died in January of 1066, after a reign of 24 years. He died as he had lived as a man of remarkable piety and equally remarkable political complexity. He left no direct heir, and in the months that followed his death, England entered a crisis of succession that would end at the Battle of Hastings that October. But here is what I want you to notice about the period between Edward's death and that battle. There was a comet. We have mentioned Halley's Comet already in this story in passing as one of the medieval world's most celebrated bad omens captured on the Bayeux Tapestry. But I want to return to it now, not just as a piece of celestial spectacle, but as a window into how the royal omen system actually worked in practice. When the comet appeared in the spring of 1066, two men were watching it with very different emotional states. Harold, who had claimed the English throne, watched it from a position of desperate anxiety. He was a king whose title was contested, whose legitimacy was disputed, and whose divine mandate was in the minds of many an open question. The comet blazing in the sky for weeks was being read by his court as a warning directed specifically at him. The Bayeux Tapestry shows it clearly, the courtiers pointing upward at the comet, their postures rigid with dread, while below them in the visual narrative appears the fleet of ships that will bring his undoing. William, watching from Normandy, chose to read the same comet differently. He read it as confirmation of his claim, as God announcing that the change of royal power the comet promised was the change William was about to bring about. Same omen. Two completely opposite interpretations. Both sides absolutely certain they were reading it correctly. And this, I think, is the most important thing the royal omen system reveals about medieval bad omens in their fullest scope. They were not simply a system of prediction. They were a system of legitimation. And because they were a system of legitimation, they were infinitely flexible. Any omen could be read in favor of the person doing the reading if that person's position and needs required it. The same comet that terrified Harold was the comet that emboldened William. The same bad harvest that proved God had abandoned one king could prove God was punishing the people for supporting the wrong king. The same plague that seemed to demonstrate divine displeasure with one ruler could be used to argue that the current ruler needed to be replaced by one more acceptable to heaven. Medieval political history is full of this kind of argument. Omens were not politically neutral. They were weapons, and the throne was the highest value target of all. Let me close this part of our story with one final detail from the royal omen tradition that I think captures its strange, moving, very human essence. The king's healing touch, the ceremony by which monarchs touched the sick and claimed to cure them, was for centuries one of the primary demonstrations of royal divine mandate. But over time, as we now know, the ceremony began to acquire its own omen logic. If a king's touch healed, it was proof of divine favor. If a king's touch did not heal, if the patients continued to suffer, if the scrofula failed to improve, if the swellings on the neck persisted despite the royal hand and the royal prayer and the gold coin called an angel hanging from the patient's neck, well, that too was a sign. Perhaps God was withdrawing his endorsement. Perhaps the anointing had not taken. Perhaps this particular king, for reasons the universe had not yet chosen to make fully explicit, was not the genuine vessel of divine power he claimed to be. The ceremony designed to demonstrate divine favor carried within it the possibility of demonstrating the opposite. Every act of royal healing was simultaneously a test, and every king who reached out his anointed hand toward a sick person knew somewhere beneath the ceremonial confidence that the outcome of that touch was not entirely within his control, which is, I think, a beautifully precise summary of the entire medieval relationship with omens. You read the signs. You did the rituals. You made the gestures toward the universe that your tradition told you were necessary. And then you waited and hoped that the universe would answer the way you needed it to. But hope was never the whole story in the medieval world, because alongside the hope woven through it, inseparable from it, was the knowledge that the universe could answer badly, that the signs could turn, that the divine judgment could go against you regardless of rank, regardless of piety, regardless of how carefully you had attended to every omen and performed every protective ritual you knew. Which brings us in the next part of our story to the people who decided they were not willing to simply hope. The people who looked at the world of bad omens and said, "We will not merely read these signs. We will fight back. We will build defenses. We will create shields. We will arm ourselves against the darkness with iron and prayer and salt and fire, and every tool that tradition and ingenuity can place in our hands." The history of medieval charms, amulets, and protective rituals is one of the most inventive, most desperate, and most genuinely touching chapters in all of human history. And the story of the horseshoe over the door, the story of why an iron horseshoe hung in exactly the right way, was once believed to be the most reliable protection a family could have against everything the universe might send against them. Begins with a blacksmith, a pair of tongs, and a visitor who arrived at his forge one afternoon with cloven hooves and a very specific request. The story of St. Dunstan and the horseshoe is one of those medieval stories that feels the first time you hear it almost too perfectly crafted to be true. And yet, here is the remarkable thing. Dunstan himself was absolutely real. He was born around 99 in Somerset, England, and he died in 988 as the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most senior ecclesiastical office in the English Church. He reformed monasteries, advised kings, composed music, and was famous across medieval England as a man of extraordinary energy, intellect, and what his contemporaries described as almost alarming spiritual force. He was also in his early life a blacksmith, and that combination, the holy man who worked with fire and iron, is where one of the most durable protective traditions in the history of the Western world was born. The story goes like this. Dunstan was working at his forge one day somewhere in the English countryside when a stranger arrived at the door and asked him to put new shoes on his horse. A simple enough request. But Dunstan, who possessed what medieval hagiographers described as an extraordinary sensitivity to the supernatural, looked at the stranger more carefully than most people would have, and he noticed the feet, not the horse's feet, the visitor's feet, because the stranger was not quite human. And beneath the ordinary clothing, where ordinary feet should have been, there were hooves, cloven hooves. Now, Here's where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because Dunstan does not do what you might expect a holy man of the period to do. He does not pray loudly or brandish a cross or flee in holy terror. He keeps working. He agrees to the request with every appearance of cooperation, takes up his tongs, heats the iron until it glows, and then instead of nailing the shoe to the horse, drives the red-hot iron directly onto the devil's own hoof. The screaming, according to various versions of the legend, was heard across considerable distances. The devil begged for relief. He pleaded. He made promises in the way that desperate beings make promises. And Dunstan, holding his tongs with the most imperturbable expression the legend allows him, offered a deal. He would remove the shoe in exchange for one promise: the devil would never enter a building where a horseshoe was displayed over the door. The devil agreed. The shoe was removed. And from that day forward, according to a tradition that spread across England, then across Europe, then across the entire Western world, then across every culture that came into contact with Western culture, a horseshoe over the door meant you have no power here. We know your weakness. This threshold is closed to you. I want to stop here for a moment and think about why this particular story from the 10th century attached itself to this particular object with such extraordinary staying power. Because there is something psychologically perfect about the horseshoe as a protective charm that goes beyond just the Dunstan legend. The horseshoe was made of iron. An iron, cold, hammered, enduring, forged from rock and fire, was the material that medieval folk belief consistently associated with power over the supernatural long before Dunstan was born. The origin of iron's protective reputation stretches back through multiple converging traditions. In Celtic culture, iron was associated with the transformation of raw earth into useful form, and the blacksmith was understood as someone who had mastered a kind of alchemy, taking something inert and dead and making it strong and purposeful. The smith occupied a liminal position between the ordinary world and the world of elemental forces, which made the products of his craft liminal objects as well. In Norse tradition, iron nails driven into the threshold of a house kept harmful spirits from crossing. In Germanic folk belief, iron weapons carried into a birthing room protected the newborn and the mother from the changeling spirits that hovered at the boundary between new life and everything beyond it. In early Christian England, iron was placed under beds, in door frames, and near cradles, not as a remnant of paganism exactly, but as a practice so deeply embedded in the culture that Christianity absorbed it rather than erased it. The horseshoe brought all of these threads together. It was iron already protective. It was shaped by a blacksmith already associated with elemental transformation. It was the iron of a working animal, a horse which the devil's servant supposedly could not ride. And it was the iron that had been attached to a living creature's body, which gave it a warmth and a connection to the living world that a mere nail lacked. And then Dunstan's legend added the final layer of covenant, not just an object with inherent power, but a specific promise extracted from the dark principle itself that this symbol would be respected. You do not just hang a horseshoe to ward off bad luck in an abstract sense. You hang a horseshoe because the devil himself agreed to leave you alone. That is a remarkably powerful narrative. It is almost impossible to improve on. But the horseshoe was only one weapon in what I have come to think of as the medieval armory of protection. And this armory was extraordinarily diverse, deeply practical in its own logic, and genuinely moving when you understand the level of daily anxiety it was designed to address. Let me walk you through some of the others. Let us start at the threshold. The threshold of a medieval house, the literal line between inside and outside, between the known world of the domestic space and the unknown world beyond, was understood as the most spiritually vulnerable point of the entire building. Evil in the medieval imagination needed an invitation or an opening to enter. It could not simply materialize inside. It had to cross the threshold, which meant the threshold had to be defended. Beyond the horseshoe above the door, medieval households in England and across northern Europe routinely buried objects in or beneath the threshold itself. We know this not from written records alone. We know it because archaeology keeps finding them. Sealed ceramic bottles called witch bottles have been discovered during renovations of old buildings across England, buried in walls, under floors, and at thresholds, some of them dating to the late medieval period and the early modern centuries. Their contents, when opened and analyzed, tell a remarkable story. iron nails, bent pins, hairnail clippings, and often a liquid that appears to have been urine. The theory behind them was precise and specific. Urine, as the most personal possible biological fluid, was understood to carry the spiritual signature of the person who produced it, combined with iron nails that would pierce and trap any malevolent force directed at that person. The bottle functioned as a kind of supernatural trap, something that would intercept and neutralize a curse or harmful intent before it could reach the person it was aimed at. The logic is strange to us, but it is internally consistent. And the fact that these objects were being made and buried in England well into the 17th and even 18th centuries tells you something important about the persistence of this way of thinking across time. Let me ask you something here, because I find this genuinely puzzling and fascinating. Do you carry anything for luck? A particular coin? An old piece of jewelry? Something in your pocket or your bag that you would feel oddly naked without? I ask because I think most of us, if we are honest, carry something, and I think that something is a direct descendant of the medieval amulet tradition, not in a mystical sense, but in a deeply human psychological one. The function of the amulet was not primarily magical, even in the medieval mind. The primary function was the reduction of anxiety. In a world where the bad omen was always potentially present, where the universe was always potentially speaking a dark message, the ability to carry a physical object that represented your defenses, your active resistance to that darkness was not irrational. It was adaptive. The person carrying an amulet felt less helpless. They had taken action. They had placed something between themselves and the worst possibilities. And the act of choosing that object, preparing it, handling it, perhaps having it blessed, all of that was itself a form of psychological processing, a way of acknowledging fear, and then doing something about it. Which is why the medieval protective tradition is so inventive and so local and so endlessly creative. Because every community, every family, every individual needed something slightly different to address the particular shape of their own anxiety. The herb garden, for example, was not merely a source of food and medicine in the medieval world. It was a spiritual armory. Specific plants carried specific protective powers documented in texts and transmitted in oral tradition across centuries. Rowan trees. The bright berried mountain ash were planted near houses and churches across the British Isles because the rowan's distinctive five-pointed star pattern visible on the bottom of each berry was understood as a symbol of divine protection. The wood of the rowan was carved into protective objects, small crosses, walking staffs, cradle decorations. In Scotland, bundles of rowan were tied with red thread, the color red itself, carrying protective significance in many traditions, and hung above stable doors to protect livestock from supernatural harm. St. John's wort was harvested on Midsummer's Eve and hung in windows and doorways, specifically as a defense against malevolent spirits who were believed to be especially active during the turning of the seasons. The timing was important. Picked at the moment of the solstice, at the precise instant when the light began to turn back. The herb carried the power of that threshold moment in time. Vein was the herb of exorcism, used in charms to drive out rather than merely repel. Where the horseshoe and the rowan kept evil out, Vein could address what had already gotten in. And St. Benedict's thistle, the plant associated with the great monastic reformer, whose metal became one of the most widely distributed amulets in medieval Catholic Europe, was believed to have power over fever and demonic illness, because the theological and the medical were, in the medieval understanding, the same category of problem. There is a passage in a 15th century English manuscript of charms and remedies that I find deeply moving, not for its magic, but for its humanity. The charm in question is directed against a child's illness. It involves specific words to be spoken over the sick child, specific herbs to be placed in specific positions, and a precise sequence of gestures. And what strikes me about it is not the individual elements which echoed dozens of similar texts from the period. It is the voice behind it. Someone cared enough to write this down. Someone facing a sick child refused the idea that nothing could be done. They reached for every tool available. The religious vocabulary of the Christian prayer tradition, the older folk knowledge of herbs and words and gestures, the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who had faced the same helplessness and found the same response. Do something. Use everything you have. Do not simply watch and wait. That impulse is not medieval. It is human, and it is I would argue, one of the most recognizable and admirable things in this entire story. The Candlemere ceremony on the 2nd of February was another node in the medieval defensive network. Candles were brought to the church and blessed on this day, not merely ceremonially, but specifically for the practical protective uses they would serve throughout the year. A blessed Candlemas candle, according to medieval folk belief, had specific powers. It could be used during thunderstorms to protect the house from lightning held burning in the window, to draw off the divine wrath before it could strike the roof. It could be lit at the bedside of the dying to ease the passage of the soul and prevent it from being seized by malevolent forces in its most vulnerable moment. It could be placed in the window when a family member was traveling to light their way back and ward off the dangers of the road. The blessing by the priest was essential. The object alone was not enough. What made the candle powerful was the combination of the physical material wax, which was associated with purity, and bees, which were understood as divinely favored creatures with the spoken words of the church's authority. This combination of the natural and the verbal was characteristic of the entire medieval protective tradition. The object alone did not protect. The words alone did not protect. The act alone did not protect. But all three together, the right object, the right words, the right intention, created something that the medieval mind believed could genuinely stand between a human being and the worst that the universe might send. And then there was iron. I keep coming back to iron because its role in the medieval protective imagination extended so far beyond the horseshoe that it deserves its own consideration. Iron nails were driven into door frames and bed frames. Iron was placed in cradles specifically to prevent the changeling substitution that medieval parents feared for their newborn children. Iron was sewn into clothing, particularly the clothing of pregnant women and new mothers at the points of the body most associated with vulnerability: hems, cuffs, necklines. Iron knives were left open on the table at night as a deterrent to spirits. Iron was hammered into the masts of ships sailing in uncertain waters. What I find most significant about iron's role is that it was so consistently associated with the threshold, the point of crossing between one state and another. Birth is a threshold. Death is a threshold. The doorway of a house is a threshold. The edge of a field, the bank of a river, the moment before sleep. All of these liminal spaces, all of these points where one thing becomes another, where the boundary between the known and the unknown is thinnest, were where iron's protective power was most needed and most applied. The medieval person who understood the world as a place where the spiritual and physical dimensions overlapped constantly at these liminal points used iron to reinforce those points, to make them harder to cross for things that should not cross them. The practical had to be made spiritual, and the spiritual had to be given a physical form. That is what the entire tradition of protective charms represents. It is not ignorance. It is not superstition in the dismissive modern sense. It is an extraordinarily coherent and internally consistent response to the experience of living in a world that felt at every moment as if it might turn against you. Let me close this part of our story with a detail I find most quietly extraordinary. Sometime in the 11th or 12th century, the exact date, like so much in this story, is uncertain. A tradition developed in England of making small wax crosses from the blessed candles of Candlemas and pressing them onto farm equipment barn doors and the tools of agricultural labor at the beginning of the working year. A cross of blessed wax pressed onto an iron plow. Two of the most powerful protective symbols in the medieval world fused together in a single small gesture, performed by someone who probably could not read, who had learned this practice from watching their parents perform it, who would teach it to their children without ever needing to explain the theology behind it. Because the theology was not the point. The point was, I have done everything I can. The fields are protected. The tools are blessed. The door has its horseshoe. The cradle has its iron. The threshold has its charm. The candle is in the window. Whatever the universe intends toward this house, this family, this life, we have answered it. We are not helpless. We are not simply at the mercy of the signs. We fight back. And here is the thing that makes me catch my breath a little every time I think about it. They were fighting back against something real. Not supernatural, as turned out. Not literally the devil with his cloven hooves. Not literally the malevolent spirit at the threshold. Not literally the cosmic forces that the medieval omen system described. but real nonetheless. The anxiety was real. The uncertainty was real. The sense that the world was dangerous and unpredictable and could turn against you at any moment. That was real, more real for a medieval person than for most of us today, because the specific dangers were more immediate and less controllable. The protective tradition did not solve those dangers. The horseshoe over the door did not prevent plague. The iron in the cradle did not stop infant mortality. The candle in the window did not prevent shipwreck. But the act of making those defenses, the act of claiming some agency, however small, over the darkness that helped people endure the anxiety and keep living in a world that warranted their fear, and that, I think, is a form of wisdom we have not entirely left behind. We've been on a long journey together through this story, and we're getting close to the end of it. But before we arrive there is one more piece that we have not yet examined. Perhaps the most important piece of all, because everything we have discussed so far has been about the past, about a world that seems from where we stand distant and different and almost incomprehensibly remote. But here is what I want you to consider as we move into the final parts of this story. The medieval world did not end. It transformed. It evolved. It changed its clothes and its vocabulary and its explanatory frameworks. But the impulse at its core, the desire to read the world for signs, to find patterns in randomness, to believe that what happens around us carries meaning about what is going to happen next. That impulse did not die with the Middle Ages. It came with us. And the question of just how far it came with us, how deep into our modern minds the medieval omen system has embedded itself, how many of our apparently modern habits and preferences and anxieties are simply the medieval fear dressed in 21st century clothing, is the question I want to explore in the final part of our story. Because Friday the 13th is not the only medieval bad omen still haunting your weekly calendar, and the number that makes the elevator skip a floor between 12 and 14 in almost every tall building in America. That number has a story that begins not in the modern world at all. It begins in a garden with a tree and a fruit, and the cosmic weight of the first choice that, according to the tradition that shaped an entire civilization's fears, went irreversibly, catastrophically, cosmically wrong. Stay with me for just a moment, because I want to try something. Wherever you are right now, lying down, sitting on the couch, curled up somewhere comfortable, I want you to think about the last time you did something that, if you stopped to examine it, honestly had absolutely no rational basis. Maybe you knocked on wood after saying something optimistic just to make sure you did not jinx it. Maybe you hesitated even slightly before doing something important on a Friday the 13th. Maybe you threw a pinch of spilled salt over your left shoulder without even fully registering that you did it. Maybe there is something you always carry with you, a particular object, a coin, a piece of jewelry, and the thought of leaving the house without it produces a small irrational anxiety that is disproportionate to the actual significance of the thing. I'm not asking in order to embarrass you. I'm asking because if any of those things sound familiar, you're not an unusually superstitious person. You are a human being who is inherited without being asked whether you wanted it. A nervous system shaped partly by hundreds of years of medieval omen reading. And the inheritance is a great deal more specific and a great deal deeper than most of us realize. Let us start with the most absurdly concrete example I know of. You are in an American city. You step into the elevator of a large hotel. You press the button for your floor, and you notice, if you're paying attention, that between the button marked 12 and the button marked 14, there is a gap. Not just a gap, an absence that has been actively constructed, engineered, paid for, incorporated into architectural blueprints, and approved by building inspectors, and agreed upon by investors and contractors and hotelers who, in every other aspect of their professional lives, are people who pride themselves on thinking rationally. The 13th floor is there, physically, undeniably, in defiance of all creative labeling. It exists. The floors are not suddenly 12.5 feet tall. The mathematics of the building has not changed. The 13th floor is simply called the 14th floor, and everyone involved agrees to this fiction, and nobody calls it a fiction. According to the Otis Elevator Company, which is, as their name suggests, the authoritative voice on the subject of what happens inside elevators, approximately 80 to 85% of buildings with at least 13 floors and Otis brand elevators do not have a floor labeled 13. 80 to 85%. A 2007 Gallup survey found that 13% of Americans, the irony of that specific percentage, is genuinely difficult to improve upon, reported that they would feel uneasy staying in a hotel room on the 13th floor. A study by a real estate research organization found that apartments on the 13th floors of buildings sold 18% less frequently than comparable apartments on other floors. And a 2002 estimate suggested that New York City, perhaps the most aggressively rational, commercially sophisticated, architecturally ambitious city on the planet, had only 5% of its residential condominium buildings with an actual 13th floor labeled as such. 5% in the most modern city, in the most modern country in the world. Because the 13th is still cursed. Not because anyone believes in the Last Supper. Not because anyone consciously recalls the Norse myth of Loki arriving as the uninvited 13th guest at the god's banquet in Valhalla and causing the death of the beloved god Balder. Not because anyone has thought carefully about the theological origins of the belief, but because the fear is older than the reasons for the fear. And here's the thing about that sequence, the fear being older than the reasons, that I find so illuminating about the entire medieval omen tradition and its survival into the modern world. When I began this story way back at the beginning, I talked about the medieval mind's fundamental conviction that the universe was speaking, that nothing was random, that signs existed and had to be read. That conviction produced a system of extraordinary specificity and complexity. The comets, the animals, the bodily twitches, the cursed calendar dates, the protective charms, the anointed kings, and then the Enlightenment happened. The scientific revolution happened. Galileo, Newton, Darwin, Pasteur. The great dismantling of the medieval explanatory framework proceeded across 3 centuries, replacing divine communication through nature with the mechanistic laws of physics and the germ theory of disease and the evolutionary logic of biology. And the medieval omen system should by all rights have dissolved. The birds are not messengers. The comets are rocks. The sneezes are airway clearance reflexes. The calendar is a human construction with no metaphysical properties. The 13th floor of a building is exactly as safe as the 12th and the 14th. We know all of this. And yet, 80 to 85% of American elevators still will not show you the 13th floor. Between 17 and 21 million Americans alter their behavior on Friday the 13th. According to the researcher Donald Dossey, who estimated the annual economic impact of this alteration, people avoiding travel, canceling weddings, refusing to sign contracts at more than $800 million per year. $800 million. Because of a fear that originated in the medieval reading of the Last Supper and the Viking myth of an uninvited dinner guest. Let me ask you something that I genuinely do not know the answer to, and that I think about more than is probably necessary. Do these behaviors make sense? Not in a dismissive way. Not in the way that the rational skeptic looks at the person knocking on wood and thinks how charming that they still do that, but in a genuine sense. Is there something these behaviors are doing that is worth paying attention to? A 2013 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found something unexpected. Researchers had participants perform rituals that were explicitly labeled as superstitious, knocking on wood, throwing salt over the shoulder. They then measured the participants' anxiety levels and performance on subsequent tasks. The people who performed the superstitious rituals reported feeling less anxious, and they performed better. Not because the rituals had magical properties, but because the act of performing a ritual, even an acknowledged one, even one has no metaphysical basis, satisfies something very deep in the human nervous system. It gives you a sense of having acted, of having done something in the face of uncertainty. And that feeling of agency, that sense of having placed yourself in the causal chain, of having done something rather than simply waiting, is not nothing. It is, as I have been suggesting throughout this entire story, one of the most fundamentally human needs there is. The medieval person throwing a pinch of spilled salt over their left shoulder was not being irrational in their own terms. They were performing an action that reduced their anxiety and restored their sense of agency in a world that felt dangerous and uncontrollable. The modern person knocking on wood, after saying something optimistic, is doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same terms for exactly the same psychological reasons. The universe we believe in has changed. The nervous system has not. There is a gesture I want to describe because I find it one of the most beautiful examples of medieval belief embedded in the modern world. Someone is about to say something that feels dangerously optimistic. Something like, "I have been so healthy this year," or "nothing has gone wrong with this project," or "I think we're going to make it." They say the words, and then almost before the words are finished, their hand reaches out. Not for anything specific, just for the nearest wooden surface, a table, a door frame, the arm of a chair, and they knock 2 or 3 times. And they feel in a way they would find difficult to articulate if you ask them to explain it, that something has been addressed, that the universe or fate or luck or whatever word they are comfortable using has been acknowledged, that the optimism has been placed in a frame of appropriate humility. That is a medieval gesture. The specific theological content has been stripped out. Nobody knocking on wood in a modern office is consciously invoking the Celtic belief that tree spirits could be awakened to provide protection, or the Christian interpretation that the wood represents the wood of the cross. The doctrine is gone, but the structure of the belief that stating good fortune aloud creates a vulnerability, that something must be done to address that vulnerability, that the right gesture toward the right material can close the opening you have inadvertently created. That structure is completely intact, and it is probably as old as language itself. Let me tell you about a custom that most people have no idea has medieval roots. In France, for several centuries, a profession existed that has no modern equivalent. These people were called quatorzeans, 14-heirs. They were socialites who made themselves available for hire, or simply as a social courtesy, to be called upon when a dinner party found itself with 13 guests. Because 13 at a dinner table was, as we have established, one of the most firmly established bad omens in the medieval world, rooted in the Last Supper, the most catastrophic dinner party in Christian history. So the quatorzean would be summoned. They would arrive. They would sit down at the table as the 14th guest, and the host, who had been pale with anxiety since counting heads, would visibly relax. 14 safe. Now I want to point out that this was not the Middle Ages. This was 17th century France, 18th century France, the age of Descartes and Voltaire, and the philosophical Enlightenment. The age of encyclopedists who were systematically dismantling the medieval worldview and replacing it with reason. And the credos continue to be employed because the fear of 13 at a dinner table ran deeper than philosophy. The knocking on wood, the salt over the shoulder, the horseshoe over the door, the skip 13th floor. All of these are what scholars of religion and anthropology call apotropaic practices. Actions designed to avert evil or bad luck. From the ancient Greek, apotropo, meaning to turn away. The word is ancient. The practices are ancient. But the impulse behind them is something that appears to be, as far as researchers can tell, genuinely universal across human cultures and human time. There is not a culture on earth that lacks some version of the protective gesture, some version of the lucky charm, some version of the ritual that addresses the universe's potential hostility and says, "I acknowledge you. I know you are there. I have done what I can." And this universality, I think, is not a sign of human foolishness. It is a sign of something the medieval theologians understood, and something that modern cognitive psychology is now, with different vocabulary and methodology, beginning to confirm. The world is genuinely uncertain. Bad things do happen randomly. The future is opaque in ways that neither science nor religion has fully resolved. And the human mind, faced with genuine uncertainty, does not remain passive. It reaches for pattern. It reaches for agency. It reaches for some form of action. However small, however symbolic, however disconnected from actual causal mechanisms. It knocks on wood. Let me close this part of our story with one last image, and then I will carry you into the final chapter. Somewhere in your city right now. It does not matter which city, because this is true of almost every city in the Western world. There's a building whose elevator buttons go 12 and then 14. And somewhere in that same city, there are people who, when something good happens, feel the reflex in their hand, the reach for the nearest wooden surface, the tap 2 or 3 times. And somewhere in that city, there are people who, when they spill salt, throw a pinch of it over their left shoulder without quite knowing why. None of these people have read a medieval almanac. None of them know who Isidore of Seville was, or what the Venerable Bede wrote about comets, or what a quatorzean was hired to accomplish. None of them have stood in front of the Bayeux Tapestry and seen the pointed fingers beneath the blazing star. But they're all in their own small ways inhabitants of the same universe that the medieval mind inhabited. A universe that speaks, a universe that watches, a universe where things mean things, and where the appropriate response to its darker signals, the appropriate response to the bad omen is not to dismiss it, but to do something about it. That is the piece of the medieval world that survived everything else. Survived the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution and 2 world wars and the digital age and whatever comes next. The omen reading may have grown quieter. The theological vocabulary may have faded. The specific creatures and calendar dates and objects that carry the weight of bad luck may have shifted and shrunk and updated themselves. But the underlying conviction that the universe has the capacity to send bad news and that the thoughtful person should pay attention and act accordingly, that conviction has not left us. It just got new wardrobe. And yet there is one more question that this entire long journey has been building toward. And it is the question I want to bring you to in this final chapter we have together. Because we have spent this whole story looking backward at the fears that were born in the medieval world and survived into ours. But here is what I want you to consider as we reach the end. What does it mean that the fear survived? Not the specific content, not the exact beliefs, but the shape of the fear, the structure of the anxiety, the fundamental human insistence that the world speaks, and that the speaking matters, and that the message can be read, and that the reading changes what you do. What does it tell us about ourselves that no amount of knowledge has fully answered the need that produced these beliefs? And what does it tell us about the medieval people? Those builders of cathedrals, those composers of music, those writers of poetry, those fearful and attentive and desperately hopeful people that the most intimate parts of their inner lives are still living inside us right now tonight. That is the question I want to sit with in the final part of our story. Not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a doorway into something larger than any of us expected this story to become. We have been traveling together for a long time tonight, through comets and black cats, through cursed calendar dates and anointed kings, through the blacksmith's forge and the plague ship and the burning pea on the island and the senator, through the 13 floors we refuse to name, and the salt we still throw over our left shoulders, and the wood we still knock on, without quite knowing why. And I want to take a moment now, before we say goodnight, to sit with the question that has been waiting quietly behind every single part of this story. Not the historical question, not the what or the when or the how, the human question. Why? Why does any of this persist? Why, after Galileo and Newton and Darwin, and every radiologist who ever showed a patient their MRI, and every meteorologist who ever explained exactly why the storm is coming? Why, after all of that, does the human mind still reach for the wooden surface, still hesitate at the unlucky date, still feel that small irrational flicker when the salt spills? The answer, I think, is both simpler and more beautiful than the cynical version of the story would suggest. It is not because we are foolish. It is not because we lack the education to know better. It is not even really because the beliefs have not been updated. It is because the beliefs are answering a question that the scientific revolution, for all its extraordinary power and genuine glory, never quite managed to dissolve. Here is the question. What does it mean? Not what caused it. Not how does it work. Not what is the mechanism. What does it mean? Because those are 2 genuinely different questions. And human beings need answers to both of them. And the second question, the meaning question, is one that science by its own design does not answer. Science tells us that the raven on the windowsill is responding to a food source. It tells us that the comet is a nucleus of ice and rock on an orbital path. It tells us that the sneeze is a respiratory reflex driven by irritants in the nasal passage. But it does not tell us, it cannot tell us whether any of these things matter to you specifically in this moment in this life. And the medieval omen system, for all its factual incorrectness, was doing something that the modern framework of pure mechanism does not do. It was insisting that things matter, that the world is not indifferent to you, that what happens around you is connected to what happens to you, that the universe is not a cold, silent mechanism grinding away in the dark with no awareness of your presence, that the crow noticed you, that the universe spoke. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying the medieval worldview was right. It was not. The crow does not bring death. The comet does not announce the fall of kingdoms. The salt you spilled at dinner was not the universe's commentary on the state of your soul. But I am saying something slightly different. I'm saying that the medieval worldview was serving the need for the world to be a place that speaks to us, that sees us, that registers our presence. That need did not go away when the worldview became obsolete. It never goes away. It is one of the most fundamental needs of the human mind. And when you understand that, really understand it, then the medieval fear of bad omens stops looking like ignorance. It starts looking like something closer to courage. Because to live in a world where everything means something is not a comfortable life. It is an attentive life, a life of sustained, exhausting, genuinely heroic engagement with reality. Every time a medieval person looked up at the night sky and felt their stomach tighten at what they saw there, they were doing something we have largely learned to avoid. They were taking the world's messages personally. They were saying, whatever happens here is not separate from me. It is addressed to me. It has something to say to me, and my job is to listen. That posture, that willingness to be spoken to by the world is something I find genuinely moving, even when the specific beliefs attached to it were wrong. There is a researcher at the University of Chicago named Jane Risen, who has spent years studying why people continue to engage in superstitious behavior, even when they intellectually know the behavior is irrational. And she found something that has stayed with me. She found that the key is not that people are unaware of the irrationality. Most people know when they knock on wood that the wood is not actually doing anything. Most people know when they avoid the 13th floor that the floor is not actually dangerous. They know they register their own logic, and then they do it anyway. Risen calls this acquiescing, deliberately allowing the intuitive system to override the rational one. Not because reason has failed, but because reason has correctly identified that the cost of the superstition is low and the psychological benefit is real. Think about that for a moment. This is not cognitive failure. This is cognitive sophistication. This is the mind saying, I understand a mechanism. I understand that knocking on wood will not change the outcome. But I also understand that performing this gesture will reduce my anxiety, restore my sense of agency, and let me move forward with greater confidence and equanimity. And since the gesture costs me nothing and gives me something real, I'm going to do it. That is not the medieval peasant being superstitious. That is the modern professional being strategically irrational in precisely the right way. And here's perhaps the thing that has most surprised me every time I return to this material. The medieval people who built the Omens system, who cataloged the signs of the natural world with such obsessive attention, who developed the protective rituals with such desperate ingenuity, who read the universe like a text and argued passionately about what each passage meant. They were not passively afraid. They were actively engaged. Think about everything we have seen in this story. The scholar in his scriptorum who looked up at the comet and reached for his quill because what he had just seen needed to be recorded and understood. The blacksmith's wife who knew exactly which herbs to burn and which words to speak when illness entered the house, and who had learned this from her mother, and would teach it to her daughter, because this knowledge was precious and had to be kept alive. The king who in his coronation robes reached out his hand toward the sick, not because he had been told to, but because he genuinely believed that he carried something in that anointed hand that could help. And that belief gave the people who touched his hand something real hope and the comfort of being seen. Even the hermit who stood before Richard II and told him the truth nobody else would speak, the truth that the signs were turning, that the universe was warning him that it was not too late to change. That hermit was not a victim of superstition. That hermit was in his own way the bravest person in the room. These were not people paralyzed by fear. They were people in conversation with the world. Let me bring you to the very last image I want to leave you with tonight. It is something I've been thinking about for a long time. Somewhere in the world right now, it is night. Somewhere it is always night. Somewhere there is a person lying awake. Not because they are afraid of anything specific. Not because there is an emergency. Just that particular kind of sleeplessness where the mind will not quiet. Where something feels slightly wrong, but you cannot name what it is. And in that wakeful moment, they might do something small. They might reach for the object on the nightstand, the coin, the piece of jewelry, the small token they have carried for years. They might close their hand around it, and the anxiety just slightly recedes. Not because the object changed anything in the world, but because the act of holding it said something. It said, I am here. I am paying attention. I have done what I can. And across 700 years of history, across the entire arc of this story, we've traveled together. That moment is continuous. The medieval woman who sewed iron into the hem of her dress on the eve of a difficult birth. The medieval monk who pressed his lips to the horseshoe above the door before setting out on a dangerous road. The medieval farmer who planted rowan near the door of his barn on a cold autumn morning. They all made the same gesture. And the person lying awake tonight holding their small talisman in the dark is making it too. Not because the medieval worldview was right, but because the human need the medieval worldview was serving was real then, and is real now, and will be real as long as there are human beings who lie awake in the dark and feel the weight of a universe that does not explain itself. So what do we do with all of this? What do we take from this long, strange, beautiful, sometimes terrifying journey through the world of bad omens? I think we take this caution about dismissing what we do not understand. The people in this story were not foolish. They were doing their best with the tools they had in a world that genuinely warranted their fear. In many of the behaviors, they developed the attentiveness to pattern the habit of asking what things mean, the impulse to take action in the face of uncertainty. Those behaviors are not relics of an obsolete worldview. They are features of being human. The omen reading is wrong in its specific content, but the impulse behind it, the insistence that the world matters, that what happens to you matters, that the universe is not indifferent to your presence, that impulse is something I would not want us to lose. I think the medieval world at its best was a world where people paid attention, where they looked carefully at what was around them, where they asked questions, not always the right questions, not always by the right methods, but where they genuinely, urgently, sometimes heartbreakingly cared about what the world was trying to say. And I think there is something in that attentiveness, something in that willingness to be spoken to that we could use a little more of. Not the superstition, the attention. Well, we have come to the end of a very long night together. And I want to say something to you genuinely before we say goodnight. Thank you. Not in a formal scripted way, in the actual way. Thank you for lying here in the dark and listening to this story for as long as you have. Thank you for staying with the medieval monks and the plagued ships and the burning cats and the boy king who lost his shoe. Thank you for letting these people, these strange, frightened, brilliant, attentive, very human people, matter to you for a little while. Because I think that is the thing that makes history more than just a collection of facts. It is the moment when the distance collapses, when you realize that the person lying awake in a farmhouse in 13th century France, listening for sounds in the dark and wondering whether the crow on the roof meant what she feared it meant. She is not so different from you, right now, in your bed, in your century, in your life. She was afraid. She hoped. She loved the people around her and wanted to protect them. She reached for whatever tools she had in a world that offered very few, and she got up the next morning and kept going. That is not so different from what all of us do every single day. Close your eyes now if they're not already closed. Let the story settle. Let the medieval world with all its omens and its fears and its stubborn, extraordinary hopefulness, let it rest alongside you for a moment. And know that the candle in the window, the horseshoe above the door, the salt thrown over the shoulder, the knock on the wood, all of those small gestures were at their heart the same thing. They were people saying to the dark, I see you. I know you are there, and I am not giving up. Good night. Sleep well. And whenever you are ready for the next story, I will be here with another journey through the parts of history that most people walk past without looking, and that turn out when you stop and really look to contain something that changes the way the world looks when you walk out of it. See you next time.